The night did not belong to anyone, and that was the problem. By late 1942, the waters around Guadalcanal had become a proving ground for something far more dangerous than surface maneuver. The island itself had already consumed months of fighting. Henderson Field stood battered but operational, a strip of contested earth that determined who could project air power across the surrounding sea. Every reinforcement convoy, every bombardment force, every carrier movement revolved around one simple reality. Whoever controlled the waters at night could decide whether Guadalcanal survived. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal was not a single engagement neatly contained in daylight. It was a series of violent collisions fought over several nights and days in November. It's when both sides committed heavily and accepted that loss would be unavoidable. This was not a probing action. It was a decision point. Japanese forces moved south with a clear objective: bombard Henderson Field into uselessness and land reinforcements strong enough to overwhelm the Marines and soldiers ashore. The plan relied on night superiority. For much of the campaign, Japanese naval crews had demonstrated remarkable skill in nocturnal engagements, using speed, coordination, and long-range torpedoes to deadly effect. The darkness favored them, it concealed movement, it rewarded precision. The United States Navy understood what was coming. American commanders assembled available forces under pressure and with incomplete information. Ships were committed knowing they might face heavier opposition. Radar, still new and imperfect, offered advantage, but only if used decisively. Crews prepared for contact at close range, aware that in confined waters near Guadalcanal, battleships and cruisers might engage at distances measured not in miles, but in moments. When the first night action erupted, it did so suddenly. Searchlights cut through darkness. Gunfire illuminated the sea in violent flashes. Ships maneuvered at high speed through confined waters, where confusion multiplied risk. Communications faltered. Identification became uncertain. Friend and foe blurred in smoke and flame. The battle devolved into chaos. American cruisers were struck hard. Destroyers were shattered in close engagements. Japanese ships absorbed punishment but continued firing. Torpedoes ran silently beneath the surface, detonating without warning. Commanders made decisions in seconds that would determine whether ships survived or burned. One of the most dramatic moments came when American battleships, including those equipped with radar-guided fire control, engaged Japanese forces intent on bombarding the airfield. Heavy guns thundered across Ironbottom Sound, shells arcing into darkness and striking with devastating effect. The scale of destruction was immense, yet neither side emerged untouched. Daylight brought air power into the equation. Aircraft from Henderson Field and carrier groups attacked damaged ships attempting withdrawal. Transports carrying Japanese reinforcements were hunted relentlessly. Some were sunk outright. Others were beached deliberately in desperate attempts to salvage troops and equipment. The struggle was relentless because the stakes were absolute. If the Japanese succeeded in neutralizing the airfield and reinforcing their ground forces, the Allied position on Guadalcanal could collapse. If the Americans held, even at terrible cost, the balance in the Pacific would tilt further away from Japanese initiative. Losses mounted on both sides. Ships that had defined pre-war naval power were crippled or sunk. Crews fought fires in darkness, sealed flooding compartments, and continued manning guns even as decks burned beneath them. The waters around Guadalcanal earned their grim name through repetition. Metal and oil marked the surface. Survivors drifted in debris-filled seas, waiting for rescue that might not come. What makes the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal extraordinary is not simply the destruction. It is the refusal of both sides to disengage. Each night renewed the contest. Each day tested whether endurance would fail before purpose did. The Americans accepted heavy losses to prevent the bombardment from succeeding. The Japanese committed capital ships in a gamble to restore momentum. In the end, the bombardment was disrupted. Reinforcements were insufficient. Henderson Field survived. The initiative in the Solomon Islands shifted further toward the United States. The battle did not end the Guadalcanal campaign immediately, but it marked a turning of pressure that Japan could not fully reverse. Naval supremacy in the region became contested in a way that favored industrial depth and sustained reinforcement, advantages that would grow steadily over time. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal stands as one of the most brutal surface engagements of the Pacific War. It represents a moment when night fighting reached its most violent expression, when radar met experience, and when command decisions made in darkness reshaped the trajectory of an entire campaign. It was not clean, it was not orderly, it was decisive. This is the story of the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, a collision of fleets in darkness where endurance, sacrifice, and relentless commitment determined whether a single island would fall or endure. Before continuing, pause for a moment and notice your surroundings. Is it quiet where you are, or is there distant movement just beyond your attention? Has the day begun for you, or is it winding down into stillness? Let yourself register the hour, not just by the clock, but by how it feels. Those sailors fought through nights that seemed endless. Let this story unfold in your time, all without rushing past what it cost. July 2nd, 1942. The mahogany conference table in the Joint Chiefs meeting room stretches beneath maps that show red arrows swallowing the Pacific. Admiral Ernest King leans forward, his fingers pressed against an island so insignificant that half the men in the room have never heard its name. Guadalcanal. The word sounds almost comical in his Massachusetts accent, syllables tumbling awkwardly as he explains why this speck of jungle, 9 degrees south of the equator, might be the only place left where America can punch back. The reconnaissance photographs arrived 48 hours earlier, still damp from the developing chemicals. A pilot flying out of Port Moresby had banked his aircraft low over something that shouldn't exist. A geometric scar carved into green chaos at a place called Lunga Point. The construction was obvious even from altitude: parallel lines, cleared jungle, the unmistakable outline of an airfield taking shape where no airfield should be. Military planners stared at those images and understood immediately what they meant. If Japan completed that runway, if bombers could stage from Guadalcanal, then the supply line between America and Australia would become a shooting gallery. Every cargo ship, every troop transport, every ton of fuel or ammunition traveling south would pass within striking distance of Japanese aircraft. The entire Pacific strategy, fragile as it already was after 6 months of defeat, would collapse before summer ended. But Guadalcanal wasn't supposed to matter. In June of 1942, when staff officers ranked strategic priorities across the Pacific theater, this island appeared at number 47 on a list of possible objectives. It had no harbor worth the name, no resources beyond coconut palms and malaria-carrying mosquitoes, no population to speak of except a few hundred villagers, and the Australian coast watchers who radioed warnings when Japanese ships passed through the slot. The island measured 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, coordinates 160 degrees east and 9 degrees south, positioned in the Solomon's chain like an afterthought. Japanese forces had occupied Guadalcanal for exactly 6 weeks, establishing a presence so minimal that Allied intelligence estimated perhaps 2,000 troops total, mostly construction units and engineers. The maps Marines studied before boarding transport ships in New Zealand were labeled Solomon Islands Survey, 1906, outdated cartography from a different era when these islands belonged to colonial administrators who never imagined them becoming battlefields. Operation Watchtower earned its codename through irony that military planners appreciated even as they scrambled to execute it. Watchtowers imply preparation, foresight, defensive structures built with care and planning. This operation had none of those qualities. When Admiral King presented his case to the Joint Chiefs, Europe was consuming every available resource. Cargo ships that might have carried Marines to the Pacific were instead ferrying supplies across the Atlantic. Aircraft that could provide air cover were being funneled toward Britain and North Africa. War at the industrial might America was slowly mobilizing remained focused on defeating Hitler first, Japan second, Guadalcanal. A distant afterthought that somehow jumped to #1 priority in the span of 3 weeks. The logic was brutal in its simplicity. Japan's East Asian co-prosperity sphere was consolidating, island by island, anchorage by anchorage, building a defensive perimeter that would take years to crack if allowed to solidify. America needed an offensive victory, any offensive victory, before Japanese engineers finished cementing their conquests with concrete runways and fortified positions. 19,000 Marines boarded transport ships in Wellington Harbor without knowing their destination. The security was so tight that company commanders opened sealed orders only after vessels cleared port. While I'm reading aloud place names that meant nothing to men who'd spent the previous months training in the oppressive heat of New Caledonia. Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Florida Island. The briefings that followed revealed an intelligence picture so incomplete it bordered on fantasy. Japanese presence estimated at 2,200 troops, primarily the 11th and 13th construction units. No significant combat forces. Limited defensive positions. The airfield under construction, but weeks from completion. Every assessment carried the unspoken caveat that these numbers came from Coast Watcher reports, aerial reconnaissance, and educated guesses rather than reliable intelligence. The Marines preparing to storm those beaches understood they were sailing toward questions, not answers. Admiral King's argument rested on timing, and that narrow window between Japanese vulnerability and Japanese strength. The airfield construction had begun June 23rd. Completion was projected for August 20th. If American forces could seize that runway before it became operational, they would control the only piece of strategic geography that mattered in the Lower Solomons. If they failed, if the invasion was delayed even 2 weeks, Japanese bombers would turn the surrounding waters into a graveyard for American shipping. The Joint Chiefs approved Operation Watchtower not because it was well planned or adequately resourced, but because doing nothing guaranteed defeat. The doctrine emerging from those July meetings would define the entire Pacific War. Island hopping, seizing positions before Japan could fortify them. Trading American industrial capacity against Japanese strategic reach in a war of attrition that favored whoever could replace losses faster. The transport ships that departed New Zealand carried supplies calculated for a brief operation. Ammunition loads sufficient for several days of combat. Food stocks adequate for initial landings. Fuel reserves measured in hours rather than weeks. Admiral Richmond Turner, commanding the amphibious force, reviewed manifests that revealed uncomfortable truths about American preparedness. Cargo vessels loaded to 60% capacity because the timeline demanded immediate departure. Heavy equipment left behind because harbor facilities couldn't load it fast enough. Artillery pieces that would prove critical in sustained combat, sitting on Auckland docks while Marines sailed without them. Nay, the operation planners had assigned it a nickname that stuck, shoestring. The word captured everything about this gamble. Minimal resources stretched to breaking point in hope that audacity might compensate for inadequacy. Behind the strategic calculations lay a simpler question that no one wanted to articulate. Could American fighting forces actually defeat Japanese troops in sustained combat? 6 months into the war, every major engagement had ended in retreat or surrender. Wake Island, overwhelmed after heroic resistance. Bataan, a death march waiting at the end of a doomed defense. The Philippines, lost despite MacArthur's promises. Java, Malaya, Singapore, a cascade of humiliations that suggested Japanese military superiority was more than propaganda. Then the Marines boarding those transport ships in Wellington carried that psychological weight alongside their rifles. They were sailing toward the first American offensive of the war, untested combat troops moving against an enemy that hadn't lost a significant battle since Pearl Harbor. The pressure was extraordinary. If Guadalcanal failed, If this shoestring operation collapsed into another humiliating withdrawal, it would validate Japanese claims about Western decadence and inferior fighting spirit. It would extend the war by years. Intelligence briefings aboard the transports tried to compensate for uncertainty with detail. Officers explained that Guadalcanal was part of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate, administered from Tulagi until Japanese occupation in May. The climate was tropical, rainfall heavy. Our temperature never dropping below 80 degrees even at night. Jungle covered most of the interior, dense vegetation that would limit mobility and visibility. The northern coast, where the airfield sat, featured coconut plantations and relatively open terrain compared to the mountainous spine running the island's length. Villages were sparse, natives generally friendly to Allied forces, though Japanese occupation complicated that relationship. Disease would be a concern: malaria, dengue fever, dysentery. The medical officers warned that tropical illness might claim more casualties than combat, that keeping troops healthy in that environment would require discipline that raw Marines might lack. The map spread across planning tables showed an island that seemed designed to frustrate military operations. Only one decent anchorage, and Japanese forces occupied it. No roads worthy of the name, just jungle tracks that became impassable mud after rain. The airfield at Lunga Point represented the only flat ground suitable for large-scale troop movements. Everything else was coconut groves, kunai grass tall enough to hide a man, and jungle so thick that visibility dropped to yards rather than miles. Marines studied those maps and understood they were about to fight in terrain that negated every advantage their training emphasized. No room for mechanized warfare. No open fields for coordinated advances. Just close-quarters combat in vegetation that swallowed entire battalions against an enemy that had been preparing defensive positions for 6 weeks while Americans scrambled to load transport ships. The island nobody wanted had become the island everyone would bleed for, and neither side fully grasped what that would cost. May 19, 1942. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto spreads naval charts across the plotting table at Combined Fleet Headquarters in Hashirajima. The anchorage sits quiet in the inland sea, capital ships swinging at their moorings while staff officers lean over maps that show the Pacific divided into zones of control. Yamamoto's finger traces a line from Rabaul through the Solomons, down past Guadalcanal toward New Caledonia. This is the perimeter. This is where Japanese expansion stops and consolidation begins. His presentation of the Kawanishi Plan takes 40 minutes, each point building toward an inevitable conclusion. If Japan can establish air bases along this arc, if fighters and bombers can stage from islands spaced at operational range, then the supply line connecting America to Australia becomes untenable. Severing that lifeline doesn't require destroying the Allied military. It simply requires making resupply too expensive to sustain. The strategic logic emerged from the victories of April and May, months when Japanese forces advanced across the Pacific with momentum that seemed unstoppable. Port Moresby threatened but not yet taken, Midway looming as the next objective. Between those operations, staff planners identified a gap in Japanese defensive coverage, a section of the Solomons where Allied aircraft could stage attacks against shipping moving south from Rabaul. Guadalcanal sat at the center of that gap, an island large enough to support a major airfield, but small enough that minimal garrison forces could defend it. The geography was nearly perfect. Close enough to Rabaul, 560 miles, that construction supplies and personnel could be delivered without extraordinary effort. Far enough south that an operational airfield would extend Japanese air coverage over shipping lanes the Allies considered safe. Naval engineers surveyed Lunga Point in early June and confirmed what aerial reconnaissance suggested: flat terrain, adequate drainage, coconut plantations that could be cleared quickly. The location was ideal. The 35th Engineer Regiment arrived June 15th, 2,200 men, equipped with the machinery and expertise to build a modern airfield in hostile territory. They came ashore at Lunga Point without opposition, natives retreating into the jungle as Japanese work parties began surveying the site. Construction commenced June 23rd. The timeline projected completion by August 20th, allowing for tropical weather delays and supply chain complications. 8 weeks to carve a runway from jungle, construct revetments and support facilities, establish the infrastructure that would turn this insignificant island into a strategic anchor point. The engineers worked with confidence born from 6 months of unbroken success. They'd built airfields at Rabaul, at Leh, at bases across the occupied territories. Guadalcanal was another project, another line on the construction manifest, notable only for its isolation and the peculiar weight Japanese naval command placed on finishing ahead of schedule. Intelligence intercepts that would later be decoded revealed the scope of Japanese planning. In 300 operational aircraft staged from Guadalcanal by October 1942, heavy bombers capable of reaching Allied bases in New Caledonia, fighter escorts with the range to protect shipping convoys all the way to Port Moresby. The projections assumed American forces remained on the defensive, reacting to Japanese initiatives rather than launching counteroffensives. Imperial Navy staff calculated they needed 600 ships positioned along the perimeter to maintain defensive superiority. That number seemed achievable given the production schedules and existing fleet strength. What never appeared in those calculations was any serious consideration of Allied offensive action before late 1943 at the earliest. Japanese planners granted themselves time that history would not provide. Yamamoto's doctrine centered on air power concentration, the principle that naval superiority in modern warfare came not from battleship duels, but from controlling the airspace above contested waters. He'd proven this at Pearl Harbor, at the Indian Ocean raids, everywhere Japanese carriers operated. But carrier-based aviation had limitations. Planes could only fly so far from their decks. Sustained operations required land bases where aircraft could refuel and rearm without returning to vulnerable carriers. The network of airfields stretching across the Pacific represented Yamamoto's vision made concrete. Each runway extended Japanese reach. Each base created overlapping zones of air coverage that made Allied movement increasingly dangerous. Guadalcanal fit into this network as the southern anchor, the final piece that would complete the defensive arc and force America into a war of attrition fought at ever-increasing distance from their supply bases. The 11th and 13th construction units worked through June and July with the efficiency that characterized Japanese military engineering. Bulldozers cleared jungle. Work parties hauled coral fill to build the runway foundation. Carpenters constructed support buildings. By early August, the airfield was 75% complete, close enough to operational that Japanese command began discussing which bomber squadrons would be assigned to Guadalcanal first. The timeline was holding. August 20th remained achievable. In Rabaul, staff officers prepared deployment orders for fighter units and ground crews. The logistics were complex but manageable. Fuel storage, ammunition magazines, personnel quarters. Everything needed to sustain air operations on an isolated island where supply ships would arrive weekly, carrying the resources to keep aircraft flying. Japanese confidence rested on assumptions that seemed reasonable in July 1942. Allied forces were reeling from defeats across the Pacific. American industrial mobilization had barely begun translating factories into weapons. British attention remained focused on Europe and North Africa. The Soviet Union was fighting for survival against Germany. No power possessed the spare capacity to mount major offensive operations in the South Pacific, not in 1942, probably not in 1943. Japanese strategic planning allowed for eventual Allied counteroffensive, but those projections placed serious threats years in the future after Japan had time to fortify positions and build the defensive depth that would make reconquest impossibly expensive. Guadalcanal was supposed to become part of that fortified perimeter, another strong point that would require massive Allied effort to dislodge. The Tokyo Express, though it didn't yet carry that name, existed as a logistics concept before becoming a desperate supply lifeline. Fast cruisers and destroyers could make the run from Rabaul to Guadalcanal in a single night, delivering troops and supplies while remaining within range of air cover for most of the voyage. The Japanese Navy had perfected this technique during the expansion campaigns, using speed and darkness to move forces with minimal risk. Then planners calculated that even after the airfield became operational, the express runs would continue, supplementing air transport with surface vessels that could carry heavier equipment. The system seemed elegant in its efficiency. By day, aircraft would defend the island. By night, ships would reinforce and resupply. Allied forces, lacking night fighting capability comparable to Japanese expertise, would find themselves unable to interdict these movements. The perimeter would hold because Japan controlled both day and night, air and sea. Construction reports filed in July showed progress matching projections. The runway measured 2,600 feet in length, adequate for bomber operations, though fighter strips would need expansion. Revetments protected 48 aircraft. Full fuel storage totaled 50,000 gallons, with plans to triple that capacity. The garrison strength remained minimal, just the construction units and a small security detachment. Japanese command saw no need for heavy combat forces. The island's value was the airfield, and the airfield's defense would come from the aircraft it hosted. Put 300 planes on Guadalcanal, and the island became effectively invulnerable to anything short of a major fleet operation, which Allied forces couldn't mount without carrier support they'd lost at Coral Sea, and would further deplete at Midway. The mathematics of attrition favored Japan. Every carrier sunk, every battleship damaged. Every month of war tilted the balance further toward the power that started with more ships and needed only to maintain what it held. In Tokyo, May the Naval General Staff reviewed Guadalcanal's progress as part of broader strategic assessments that dominated June and July. The losses at Midway had complicated planning, forced reconsideration of aggressive expansion toward Hawaii and Alaska, but the southern perimeter remained viable. New Guinea could still be secured. The Solomons could still become the defensive barrier that protected Rabaul and everything behind it. Guadalcanal was on schedule. The Americans were on their heels. Given another 3 months, given time to finish construction and deploy forces, the strategic picture would stabilize into a frozen conflict where Japan held interior lines and Allies faced the prospect of reconquering the Pacific island by island against fortified positions. That was the blueprint. That was the plan. August 20th, 1942. Was supposed to be the day that plan became irreversible. Instead, it became the deadline that defined everything. July 2nd, 1942. Same day Admiral King points at Guadalcanal in Washington. 3,000 miles away in Auckland, New Zealand, Admiral Robert Gormley receives a dispatch that will end any hope of careful planning. The message comes encrypted with the highest priority classification, orders from King himself, transmitted through channels that leave no room for interpretation. Intelligence indicates Japanese forces are constructing an airfield on Guadalcanal. Operation must proceed without undue delay. That final phrase, without undue delay, strips away any illusion that this will be a properly resourced offensive. Gormley stares at the message and understands he's being ordered to execute a major amphibious assault with forces that haven't finished assembling, supplies that haven't finished loading, and intelligence that barely qualifies as reconnaissance. The reconnaissance photographs show construction in progress, but little else. Japanese troop strength remains estimated at perhaps 2,000, primarily construction units rather than combat forces. That number will be revised upward multiple times before Marines ever reach the beaches. But in early July, the assessment shapes planning that assumes light resistance. Admiral Frank Fletcher, commanding Task Force 61, reads his orders with the skepticism of a man who's already lost one carrier at Coral Sea and nearly lost another. as he's being asked to provide air cover with 3 carrier task forces for an operation whose duration no one can predict. Fletcher insists on one critical caveat that will haunt the entire campaign: 5 days. He can guarantee air support for 5 days, maybe less if Japanese counterattack forces his carriers to withdraw. After that, the Marines will be on their own, and Fletcher makes absolutely certain that everyone from Gormley to King understands this limitation. 10 days to plan an operation that military doctrine suggests requires 6 months. Staff officers aboard USS Saratoga work through July with the intensity of men who know they're improvising a major offensive from fragments and guesswork. Transport ships, cargo vessels, destroyer screens, cruiser support, minesweepers, hospital ships. The logistics of moving 19,200 Marines from New Zealand to Guadalcanal stretch available resources past any rational safety margin. Quartermasters calculate supply loads and discover they can achieve perhaps 60% of optimal capacity before the departure deadline. That missing 40% represents ammunition, food, heavy weapons, construction equipment, medical supplies, everything a landing force needs to sustain operations after the initial assault. The officers making these calculations understand they're sending Marines ashore, with supplies measured in days when the campaign might last weeks or months. July 26, 1942. The final invasion conference convenes aboard USS Saratoga while the task force steams toward the target zone. Admiral Fletcher, Admiral Turner, commanding the amphibious force, and Major General Alexander Vandegrift, commanding the 1st Marine Division, gather around charts that show what little they know about Guadalcanal. Vandegrift reviews his forces: 19,200 Marines, most of them combat virgins who have trained in New Caledonia but never fired at an enemy. The division represents America's only available offensive force in the Pacific, cobbled together from units that were still forming when the war started. They're professional Marines, but they're untested, and they're about to conduct the first American amphibious assault since the Spanish-American War. The weight of expectation sits heavy in that conference room. Failure doesn't just mean one lost battle. Failure means accepting that American forces can't compete with Japanese military effectiveness. The force composition reflects everything rushed and improvised about Operation Watchtower. 75 transport ships carrying Marines and their equipment, 16 cruisers providing gunfire support and anti-aircraft protection, 8 destroyers for screening and reconnaissance, 3 carriers, Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp, whose aircraft will provide the only air cover Marines can expect. Fletcher's 5-day commitment hangs over every discussion of how the operation will unfold. 5 days to land troops, secure the airfield, establish defensive positions, and somehow prepare for sustained operations without naval support. The officers studying these timelines understand the mathematics don't work. 5 days isn't enough. But 5 days is what they have, and hesitation would be worse than attempting the impossible. Intelligence briefings try to fill gaps with analysis that amounts to educated speculation. The Japanese airfield is 75% complete. Enemy garrison estimated at 2,000 to 3,000 troops. No significant artillery. Limited defensive fortifications. Jungle terrain will complicate movements but shouldn't prevent rapid advance to Lunga Point. Every assessment carries implicit uncertainty. Coast Watcher reports provide fragmentary information. Aerial reconnaissance captures snapshots rather than comprehensive understanding. No one has surveyed the beaches where Marines will land. No one knows the composition of Japanese forces. No one can predict whether resistance will be minimal or catastrophic. Vandegrift listens to these briefings and knows he's committing his division based on intelligence that might be completely wrong. The psychological pressure extends beyond tactical concerns. 6 months of defeat have shaped every conversation about American military capability. The fall of the Philippines demonstrated that American forces could fight with courage, but still lose to better prepared enemies. Wake Island showed that heroism wasn't enough without adequate support. The Navy's performance at Pearl Harbor left questions about whether American forces could match Japanese technical skill. Operation Watchtower becomes the test case that will either validate or demolish the theory that American troops can win offensive campaigns against veteran Japanese units. The stakes transcend Guadalcanal. If this fails, if Marines are thrown back into the sea or pinned on beaches unable to advance, the entire Pacific strategy collapses into defensive holding actions that postpone eventual Allied victory by years. Admiral King's strategic calculus ignored conventional wisdom about offensive operations requiring 3-to-1 numerical superiority. The Japanese have 2,000 troops. The Americans will land 19,000. That seems overwhelming until you factor in defenders occupying prepared positions, attackers advancing across beaches into unknown terrain, and the certainty that Japanese reinforcements will arrive from Rabaul as soon as the invasion begins. The real question isn't whether Marines can seize the airfield. The question is whether they can hold it after Fletcher's carriers withdraw, after transport ships depart, and after the Navy leaves them isolated on an island that Japan will fight desperately to recapture. No one in that July 26 conference has good answers. They have commitment, determination, and the slim hope that audacity might compensate for inadequate preparation. Vandegrift's Marines board transport ships knowing less about their destination than any amphibious force in modern military history. They know they're going to an island called Guadalcanal. They know it's in the Solomons. They know the Japanese are there. Everything else is rumor, speculation, and maps so outdated they're nearly worthless for tactical planning. Company commanders receive briefings that amount to land, advance inland, secure the airfield, prepare for counterattack. The simplicity reflects genuine ignorance rather than clear operational vision. This is expedition warfare conducted with inadequate intelligence, insufficient supplies, and a timetable driven by strategic necessity rather than tactical readiness. The Marines accept this because they are Marines, because someone has to go first, because the only thing worse than a poorly planned offensive is no offensive at all. The task force steams northwest from New Zealand through the last week of July, 60,000 tons of shipping, moving toward the Solomons at 14 knots. Fletcher's carriers form the outer screen, positioned to launch strikes against Japanese air bases at Rabaul if enemy aircraft attempt to interfere with the landing. Turner's amphibious force follows, transport ships loaded with Marines and cargo vessels carrying the supplies that will sustain operations if everything goes according to plan. The weather holds. The seas remain relatively calm. Intelligence reports no Japanese naval forces in position to intercept. But everyone from admiral to rifleman understands that surprise only lasts until the first shell lands, until Japanese coast watchers radio warnings, until Rabaul responds with everything it has. The operation is designated shoestring for good reason. It's held together with hope and improvisation. Resources stretched so thin that any complication could snap the entire enterprise. Breaking point isn't hypothetical. It's the operational baseline from which everything else will be measured. August 7th, 1942, 0614 hours. The darkness over Savo Sound erupts as USS Quincy opens fire, and her 8-inch guns throwing shells toward Guadalcanal with the roar that announces the Pacific War's first American offensive. USS Astoria and Vincennes join the bombardment. 24 heavy guns hammering suspected Japanese positions around Lunga Point with 6,800 shells in 2 hours 20 minutes. The naval gunfire is supposed to soften defenses, destroy artillery positions, scatter defenders before Marines ever reach the beaches. What it actually accomplishes is psychological rather than tactical. Japanese construction units scattered across the island understand immediately that something catastrophic is happening, but Coordination is impossible in the chaos, communication breaks down, and confusion becomes the real weapon that morning, rather than high explosives. The first wave of Marines hits the beaches at 09:10 hours. Landing craft grind onto sand at Lunga Point. Ramps drop, and riflemen wade ashore, expecting the devastating fire that military doctrine predicts should greet any amphibious assault. Instead, they find abandoned positions, scattered equipment, and jungle that seems to swallow sound. The silence is unnerving. Training prepared them for combat, not for walking unopposed across beaches into coconut groves where the only movement comes from native birds startled by naval bombardment. 1st Platoon, Company A, reports no enemy contact at 09:25. By 1000 hours, 3,000 Marines are ashore and advancing inland with minimal resistance. By 1300 hours, 10,000 troops have landed, and the operation has succeeded beyond anyone's reasonable expectations. The explanation for light resistance becomes clear as reconnaissance patrols push deeper inland. Japanese forces, primarily the 11th and 13th construction units, totaling approximately 600 personnel on the immediate perimeter, had scattered into the jungle at first indication of American attack. Their orders were to build an airfield, not defend against invasion. Most of the construction workers carried no weapons beyond personal sidearms. Combat troops that might have organized defense were concentrated at Tulagi across the Sound, where Marines simultaneously landed facing much fiercer opposition. The Japanese commanders on Guadalcanal never anticipated that America would mount a major offensive this early in the war. And their defensive planning assumed months of warning, time to bring in army units and establish proper fortifications. Instead, they got naval bombardment at dawn, followed by an invasion force that overwhelmed the island's entire defensive capacity before noon. Marines advancing toward the airfield discover evidence of how close they came to losing the race against Japanese construction schedules. The runway stretches 2,600 feet, finished enough for operations, though not yet fully operational. Revetments protect aircraft parking areas. Fuel storage tanks hold thousands of gallons. Supply depots contain food, ammunition, construction materials, everything needed to sustain air operations. Captured documents reveal completion date projected for August 20th, 13 days away. If Operation Watchtower had been delayed 2 weeks, if commanders had insisted on more thorough planning, Japanese bombers would already be staging from this field, and the invasion fleet would have sailed into a killing zone. Instead, Marines walk through abandoned facilities. Japanese mechanics fled so quickly they left tools lying beside aircraft they were assembling. The margin between success and disaster was measured in days. By evening of August 7th, Colonel Clifton Cates reports the situation with careful optimism. Surprisingly, light opposition. Airfield secured intact. Perimeter expanding to encompass all critical infrastructure. But then he adds the observation that will define the coming months. Cargo vessels departing at dusk. Transport ships pulling anchor. The Navy is leaving, Nye executing Fletcher's plan to withdraw carriers after minimal exposure to Japanese counterattack. Marines watch from beaches as ships that brought them disappear over the horizon, taking with them the supplies still unloaded, the heavy equipment still in cargo holds, the ammunition and food that would sustain operations beyond the immediate crisis. First-day casualties tell one story. 6 Marines killed, 31 wounded. Japanese losses estimated at 500 plus. But the real story is written in those departing ships. The Japanese reaction to the invasion begins that same day, though Marines won't feel it fully until darkness falls. At Rabaul, staff officers receive reports that initially seem impossible. American forces landing at Guadalcanal, multiple ships, thousands of troops. The scale suggests this isn't a raid, but a major offensive, something Japanese planning never seriously considered possible in August 1942. Admiral Gunichi Mikawa commands 8th Fleet at Rabaul, and he makes the decision that will shape the campaign's naval dimension. He will take his available cruisers south immediately, tonight, and attack the American fleet while it's concentrated around Guadalcanal. The assembly happens with remarkable speed. 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer depart Rabaul that afternoon, steaming south at maximum speed with orders to destroy American naval forces and cut off the invasion from seaborne support. Marines dig in around Henderson Field, the name they have already given to the captured airfield in honor of a pilot killed at Midway. The perimeter isn't sophisticated yet, all just hastily prepared positions using whatever materials are available. Coconut logs become bunker walls. Foxholes are scraped into coral and sand. Ammunition is distributed with careful attention to conservation, because no one knows when resupply ships will return. Rations are calculated based on captured Japanese stocks, supplementing American supplies. Water becomes the immediate concern, finding clean sources on an island where every stream might carry disease. The temperature never drops below 80 degrees. Humidity makes every movement exhausting. Insects swarm as darkness approaches. This is the reality that training in New Caledonia could only approximate, the physical toll of tropical warfare that will prove as dangerous as enemy action. Company commanders gather what intelligence they can from the day's advances. Japanese construction units fled east and south. Estimates suggest 800 to 1,000 enemy personnel remain scattered across the island's eastern approaches. No contact with heavy combat units yet, but captured documents reference regiments stationed at Rabaul and Bougainville. Those forces will come. The only question is when and in what strength. Defensive planning proceeds based on worst-case assumptions. Japanese counterattack will come by sea, landing fresh troops on beaches Marines haven't secured. Enemy aircraft will strike from Rabaul once visibility improves tomorrow. The Navy might not return. Supply situation will deteriorate. Everything depends on holding the airfield and making it operational for American aircraft before Japanese reinforcements arrive in overwhelming numbers. The first night on Guadalcanal passes in nervous vigilance. Marines who've never experienced combat listen to jungle sounds that might be enemy infiltrators or might be tropical wildlife. False alarms trigger bursts of rifle fire. Flares illuminate nothing but vegetation. The psychological strain of waiting for attack that doesn't come proves worse than actual combat would be. Dawn on August 8th brings relief and new concerns. Another day to consolidate positions. Another day to inventory captured supplies. Another day that Marines remain unsupported by naval forces that withdrew before unloading was complete. Intelligence reports indicate Japanese naval forces approaching from the north. Contact expected tonight. The invasion's success becomes hostage to whether American cruisers can defend the approaches long enough for Marines to establish defensive depth that might withstand isolation. Colonel Vandegrift surveys the airfield and understands the strategic reality with painful clarity. Marines have seized their objective. They control the most important piece of ground in the South Pacific, but holding it requires transforming this airstrip into an operational base fast enough that American aircraft can provide the air cover Fletcher's carriers won't. Engineers assess the runway. Another week of work makes it fully functional. Until then, Marines are holding terrain they can't adequately defend against enemy air attack. It's sitting on an island where supply lines depend on naval supremacy that last night's departing cargo vessel suggests may not exist. First light revealed that seizing Guadalcanal was possible. Second light reveals that keeping it might prove impossible. Between those realizations lies everything the next 6 months will cost. August 9th, 1942, 01:36 hours. The darkness over Savo Sound is absolute moonless night, giving visibility measured in yards rather than miles. Aboard USS Blue, a destroyer on picket duty, radar operators detect contacts to the northwest, ships approaching at high speed. The report goes up the chain of command while officers try to interpret whether these are friendly vessels returning or enemy forces. The American doctrine relies on daytime fighting, where superior gunnery can be brought to bear at range. Night combat is chaos, identification nearly impossible, coordination breaking down into confusion. The contacts continue closing. By 0143, lookouts on USS Ralph Talbot visually spot the approaching formation. Japanese cruisers in line ahead, searchlights off, steaming toward the American screening force at 30 knots. The warning radio to flagship gets lost in communication failures. Several captains never receive it. Admiral Mikawa's force threads between Savo Island and Cape Esperance like a sword thrust into scattered defenses. His 7 cruisers, Chokai, Furutaka, Kako, Kinugasa, Aoba, and destroyers have rehearsed night battle tactics until they function with precision that American forces can't match. Japanese lookouts spot USS Astoria first. At 0148, Chokai's searchlights snap on, brilliant beams illuminating the American cruiser like stage lights revealing an actor. For perhaps 5 seconds, Astoria's bridge crew stares into that blinding glare while trying to understand what's happening. Then shells arrive. 8-inch rounds strike the superstructure with explosions that shatter bridge windows and kill everyone in the pilot house. Fire spreads immediately. Damage control parties rush to contain blazes, while return fire from Astoria's turrets shoots wildly at targets barely visible through smoke and darkness. USS Vincennes dies next. Captain Frederick Reef Cole orders his cruiser to open fire, but confusion about targets makes effective gunnery impossible. Japanese shells walk up Vincennes' length, is penetrating engine rooms and starting fires that rapidly become uncontrollable. Reef Cole's last recorded command becomes the epitaph for American night fighting doctrine. Cease firing, I don't know what we're firing at. The admission captures everything wrong with American preparedness for this kind of combat. Superior radar means nothing if crews don't trust it. Better damage control accomplishes nothing if ships are hit before they can maneuver. Training emphasizes daytime gunnery duels at ranges where optical sighting works. This is knife fighting in the dark, and Japanese forces trained extensively for exactly these conditions, while American Navy focused on scenarios that never materialized. USS Quincy becomes the 3rd casualty in 30 minutes of running gun battle. Captain Samuel Moore attempts to maneuver away from the Japanese column, but torpedoes strike the cruiser's engineering spaces. The ship loses power and drifts while Japanese shells systematically destroy every functional system. Moore dies on the bridge when a salvo decapitates the fire control center. Quincy rolls onto her side at 0238 and sinks in 17 minutes, taking 370 sailors with her. Survivors report the horror of being trapped in flooded compartments, the screams of wounded men as the ship capsized, the oil fires on the water's surface that burned anyone trying to swim to safety. Morning will reveal bodies floating in the Sound, American sailors who survived the sinking, only to drown in the darkness because rescue vessels couldn't find them. A USS Astoria survives the initial engagement, but burns through the night. Damage control parties fight fires in the superstructure, while engineers struggle to maintain steam pressure. By dawn, the situation is hopeless. Captain William Greenman orders abandoned ship at 1100 hours on August 9th. Astoria settles by the stern and slips beneath the surface at 12:16, taking 272 casualties down with her. The 4th American cruiser, USS Chicago, escapes serious damage through luck rather than skill. She takes a single torpedo hit that floods a forward compartment, but remains operational, limping away from the battle while Japanese forces complete their execution of the screening force. By 0220, though Mikawa's cruisers have sunk 4 American cruisers and damaged 2 destroyers without losing a single ship. The most one-sided naval defeat in American history unfolds in 32 minutes of darkness. The technical superiority that doomed American cruisers becomes clear in subsequent analysis. Japanese Type 93 torpedoes, nicknamed Long Lance by Allied intelligence, had effective range of 22 miles at 40 knots. American torpedoes managed perhaps 6 miles at 35 knots. Japanese cruisers could launch torpedo spreads from distances where American ships couldn't even detect them, let alone evade. The oxygen-fueled torpedoes left no wake, making visual detection impossible even in daylight. At night, with visibility near zero, odd American vessels sailed into torpedo spreads without any warning beyond the explosions when warheads struck. This wasn't just tactical superiority. This was technological advantage that made conventional countermeasures useless. American doctrine emphasized gunnery because American naval construction focused on guns. Japanese doctrine emphasized torpedoes because Japanese engineers built the most lethal torpedoes in the world. Admiral Mikawa makes the decision that historians will debate for decades. After destroying the screening force, with American transport ships sitting in Lunga roads like sheep waiting for slaughter, he orders his cruisers to withdraw. The reasoning seems sound in the moment. American carriers are somewhere to the east. His force has accomplished its primary mission of demonstrating Japanese naval supremacy. Daylight will bring American aircraft, and cruisers without air cover become vulnerable targets. Better to withdraw with a complete victory than risk losses pursuing marginal gains. The decision saves his ships, but squanders the opportunity to destroy transport vessels, cut off Marines completely, potentially force evacuation of Guadalcanal before the operation truly begins. Mikawa reports sinking 2 battleships and 6 cruisers, inflating his success in the chaos. The reality was 4 cruisers sunk, but the impact on American naval confidence was even more devastating than the actual losses. Dawn on August 9th reveals the catastrophe's full scope. 1,270 American sailors dead. 4 cruisers on the bottom, 1 destroyer damaged. Survivors floating in oil-slicked waters waiting for rescue. Marines on Guadalcanal watch the rescue operations from shore and understand they have been abandoned not by choice, but by necessity. Admiral Turner, commanding the amphibious force, makes the inevitable decision. Without cruiser protection, transport ships cannot remain in the area. Immediate withdrawal is the only option that prevents losing the entire invasion fleet. By 02:30 on August 9th, even before Mikawa's cruisers have withdrawn, Turner is ordering cargo vessels to raise anchor. The unloading that was supposed to continue for days, that was supposed to establish supply stockpiles adequate for sustained operations, ends after 36 hours. Marines receive the news at dawn. They're on their own. The psychological impact extends beyond immediate tactical concerns. American naval forces had been humiliated in a night action where superior technology and training meant nothing against enemy doctrine they couldn't counter. Every assumption about naval supremacy, about technological advantage, about American industrial might, translating to battlefield effectiveness, had been shattered in half an hour of darkness. Marines trapped on Guadalcanal understand immediately what Savo Island means. No resupply, no reinforcement, no naval gunfire support. They're holding an island that Japan will try desperately to recapture, and they're doing it with whatever supplies made it ashore before Turner's fleet scattered. First week of the campaign reveals the fundamental truth that will define the next 6 months. This isn't a battle for an island. This is a battle of supply lines and logistics, or fought by Navy and Marines simultaneously, where victory goes to whoever can sustain operations longest against an enemy, doing everything possible to cut their lifelines. The night the Navy died becomes shorthand for American naval inadequacy in close combat, but it also marks the beginning of painful learning. Every mistake made at Savo Island will be analyzed, dissected, incorporated into new doctrine. Radar usage will improve. Night fighting tactics will evolve. Communication procedures will be overhauled. But those lessons come later, purchased with lives lost in darkness when American cruisers sailed into a battle they couldn't win, using tactics that hadn't prepared them for this kind of warfare. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, August 9th means something simpler and more immediate. They're alone. The island is theirs to hold or lose based entirely on their ability to outlast Japanese reinforcements that are certainly coming, probably soon, definitely in strength that will test whether American ground forces can compete with Japanese combat effectiveness when naval and air superiority no longer tips the balance. August 9th, 1942, 0230 hours, while Savo Island battle still rages. Admiral Richmond Turner stands on the bridge of his flagship and watches searchlight beams illuminate the horizon where American cruisers are dying. The radio reports coming through are fragmentary, confused, increasingly desperate. Ships hit. Ships sinking. Japanese forces overwhelming the screening force. Turner faces the decision that every amphibious commander dreads. His transport ships are loaded with 19,000 tons of supplies still waiting to be unloaded. Those vessels are now sitting targets if Mikawa's cruisers push through the destroyed screening force. Withdrawal means abandoning Marines with inadequate supplies. Staying means risking the entire invasion fleet. The mathematics are brutal. He orders immediate departure. By dawn, cargo vessels are raising anchor and steaming away from Guadalcanal, leaving Marines to survive on whatever made it ashore. General Alexander Vandegrift receives Turner's message at 1500 hours on August 9th. The words are professionally neutral, but the meaning is devastating. We are losing our Navy. Marines will have to live on what they have or do without. Vandegrift reads it twice, understanding immediately what this means for his division. AA's supply situation goes from adequate to desperate in one sentence. No resupply timeline. No guarantee that ships will return. The assumption that cargo vessels would shuttle supplies for days, building stockpiles sufficient for sustained operations, evaporates with Turner's withdrawal. Marines are holding the most strategically important island in the South Pacific, with ammunition calculated for 8 days of combat, food for 37 days at half rations, and no heavy equipment, because that was still in cargo holds when the fleet departed. Vandegrift's response becomes legendary in Marine Corps history. 4 hours after receiving Turner's message, he radios back, "We will take what's on this beach and hold it." The brevity captures everything about Marine identity, aiding that combination of stubbornness and tactical flexibility that refuses to acknowledge impossible situations. But behind the defiant words lies desperate calculation. Supply officers inventory what made it ashore. Artillery shells for the 5 howitzers they have, adequate for one major engagement or several minor actions. Rifle ammunition, sufficient if conserved carefully. Mortar rounds, limited. Medicine, inadequate for sustained casualties. Fuel, enough to keep vehicles running for perhaps 2 weeks. Food, 37 days assumes half rations and no spoilage in tropical heat. Every category shows the same pattern, enough to survive short term, not enough to sustain operations if Japanese counterattack with the strength Vandegrift expects. The strategic implications ripple outward from Guadalcanal to Washington, and Admiral King receives reports of Savo Island and immediately grasps the crisis. Operation Watchtower was already being conducted on minimal resources. Now, it's being sustained with no resources. The political pressure intensifies. 6 months into the war, America's first offensive has turned into a potential disaster, where 19,000 Marines might be cut off and destroyed because the Navy couldn't protect supply lines. King faces questions from the Joint Chiefs about whether evacuation should be considered. The debate happens in conference rooms far from the island, but it shapes everything. If America abandons Guadalcanal now, if Marines are evacuated and the airfield returned to Japanese control, the entire Pacific strategy collapses. Japanese propaganda would proclaim it as proof that American offensive capability was fiction. The psychological impact would extend the war by years. Admiral Robert Gormley, South Pacific commander, represents the other side of the strategic debate. His forces just suffered catastrophic naval defeat. 4 cruisers sunk in 30 minutes means American naval strength in the theater is crippled. Japanese forces control the waters around Guadalcanal every night, free to reinforce and resupply, while American ships hide beyond aircraft range during darkness. Gormley's assessment is coldly logical. Without naval supremacy, Marines cannot be adequately supplied. Without adequate supplies, they cannot hold the island against determined Japanese counterattack. Evacuation becomes not a matter of if, but when. Better to withdraw now, preserve the division for operations where they have chance of success, or than lose 19,000 Marines in a siege that ends with surrender or annihilation. The argument against evacuation rests on one fact that changes all calculations. Henderson Field is nearly operational. Engineers report 1 week of work makes it usable for fighter aircraft. Once American planes are based on Guadalcanal, air cover extends over the surrounding waters during daylight hours. Japanese can still control the night, but Americans will control the day. Supply ships can unload under air protection. Reinforcements can be landed. The island becomes defensible not through naval supremacy, but through air superiority staged from the very airfield Japan built and America captured. This possibility keeps Vandegrift's Marines on the island through August, while debate rages about whether they should evacuate. Henderson Field represents the difference between Guadalcanal as liability and Guadalcanal as strategic asset. Everything depends on making that runway operational before Japanese forces retake it. Japanese strategic calculations mirror American debates with inverted logic. Admiral Mikawa's victory at Savo Island proves Japanese naval superiority in night action, but Tokyo understands the action's limitations. 4 cruisers sunk doesn't eliminate American naval power. Enterprise and Saratoga remain operational somewhere to the east. More carriers are certainly coming. The window for recapturing Guadalcanal is limited, measured in weeks rather than months. Japanese 8th Fleet at Rabaul begins planning reinforcement operations that will deliver combat troops, not construction units, to overwhelm Marine defenses. The assessment is optimistic. American forces are isolated, undersupplied, probably demoralized by naval defeat. 1 regiment of veteran Japanese infantry should suffice to retake the airfield. Operation will commence within 10 days. Guadalcanal will return to Japanese control before end of August. Marines spend the week after Savo Island transforming from invasion force to garrison force. Defensive perimeter extends 4 miles around Henderson Field. Foxholes become bunker systems. Observation posts are established at key approaches. Ammunition is distributed to company strong points rather than kept in central magazines. Food stocks are inventoried daily. Ration discipline enforced with severity that reflects how precarious supply situation has become. Water sources are tested, treated, guarded. Disease becomes immediate concern as tropical heat and humidity create perfect conditions for dysentery, malaria, dengue fever. Medical officers treating patients understand they're fighting 2 enemies simultaneously. Japanese forces that will certainly attack, and tropical illnesses that kill just as effectively as bullets. The psychological strain of isolation affects every Marine differently. Some focus on immediate tasks, digging fighting positions, or improving fortifications. Others obsess over the horizon, watching for ships that might bring resupply or reinforcement. Everyone understands they're participating in an operation that has gone terribly wrong, but might still be salvageable. The uncertainty is corrosive. No one knows when Japanese counterattack will come. No one knows if American reinforcements will arrive first. No one knows if this island they've seized will become their graveyard or their victory. Letters written home during this period, later recovered from personal effects, reveal men trying to maintain morale while privately doubting whether they'll survive to write another letter. The optimism required for military effectiveness coexists with realistic assessment that their situation is desperate. Vandegrift convenes staff meetings twice daily, forcing officers to confront problems systematically rather than reactively. supply allocation, defensive priorities, intelligence gathering, engineering timelines for Henderson Field. Every discussion circles back to the fundamental question: can Marines hold this position long enough for the strategic situation to improve? The consensus is carefully hedged. Yes, if Henderson Field becomes operational quickly. Yes, if Japanese reinforcement comes piecemeal rather than in overwhelming strength. Yes, if American command commits resources to sustaining Guadalcanal rather than abandoning it. Too many ifs, too much uncertainty. But the alternative to holding is evacuation. And evacuation means accepting defeat in America's first offensive of the war. That becomes unthinkable, not because defeat is impossible, but because its consequences extend so far beyond this island that contemplating them threatens the larger strategic vision King articulated when he first pointed at Guadalcanal on a map and said, "This is where we fight." August 9th through August 12th, 1942. While admirals debate strategy, Marines dig. All the defensive perimeter around Henderson Field extends from the Lunga River on the west to Alligator Creek on the east, 4 miles of front where 19,000 men transform jungle and coconut groves into fortified positions. Colonel Clifton Cates commands the eastern sector, the most vulnerable approach because Japanese forces scattered during the invasion fled in that direction. Intelligence suggests 800 to 1,000 enemy personnel somewhere beyond American lines, disorganized but eventually destined to regroup and counterattack. Cates orders construction of what becomes known as the Alligator Creek Line, interlocking defensive positions designed to channel any assault into killing zones where Marine firepower can be concentrated. The fortifications evolve through trial and error, Marines learning tropical warfare principles that training never covered. Coconut logs, the only building material available in quantity, become bunker walls. 8 feet high, layered 3 deep, they stop rifle rounds and shell fragments while providing firing ports for defenders. The coral sand makes digging difficult, but drainage excellent. Foxholes that don't flood even in tropical downpours. Each position is sited to cover adjacent positions. Crossfire doctrine making isolated penetration suicidal for attackers. Barbed wire would be ideal, but supplies didn't include enough. Instead, Marines improvise obstacles using fallen trees, sharpened stakes, anything that slows attacking infantry long enough for defenders to bring weapons to bear. 3,000 Marines work construction details while maintaining security patrols. The dual requirement meaning everyone exhausted and no one getting adequate rest. Engineers assess Henderson Field with the urgency of men who understand the entire campaign depends on their work. The runway needs extension. 2,600 feet inadequate for fully loaded bombers. Drainage requires improvement. Tropical rain turning taxiways into mud that grounds aircraft. Revetments need reinforcement, protection against Japanese air raids that will certainly target the field once it becomes operational. Fuel storage must be expanded and dispersed, concentrated tanks inviting catastrophic losses from single bomb hits. The engineering challenges multiply faster than solutions. But work proceeds around the clock because every day brings closer the moment when fighters can launch from Henderson Field and provide air cover that makes the island defensible. August 19th, 1942. Japanese 28th Regiment, 917 troops commanded by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, lands east of American perimeter at Taivu Point. The landing goes undetected by Marine patrols, Japanese forces moving at night and remaining concealed during daylight. Ichiki's orders are straightforward: advance west, attack American positions, recapture the airfield. The regiment represents Japan's first attempt to retake Guadalcanal with organized combat forces rather than scattered construction units. Intelligence from Rabaul estimates American strength at 2,000 troops, yet poorly supplied and demoralized by naval defeat at Savo Island. Ichiki believes he faces disorganized defenders who will collapse under determined assault. The assumption will prove catastrophically wrong, but in mid-August, Japanese confidence remains unshaken by realities they haven't yet confronted. The first contact happens by accident. Marine patrol from Company A encounters Japanese scouts probing the eastern perimeter. Brief firefight kills 3 enemy soldiers and yields documents that intelligence officers translate with growing alarm: unit roster, orders, supply manifests. The captured papers reveal that Japanese forces have landed in regimental strength and plan to attack imminently. Captain Charles Brush, commanding the patrol, radios warning to division headquarters. Vandegrift immediately alerts all units. When the first real test of Marine defensive positions is coming, and it's coming tonight. Cates reinforces the Alligator Creek line with every available man. Artillery batteries prepare pre-planned fire missions. Mortar crews stockpile rounds. Everyone understands this isn't reconnaissance in force. This is full assault intended to break American defenses. August 21st, 1942, 0300 hours. Ichiki's regiment attacks across Alligator Creek in the darkness, 900 troops advancing in column toward Marine positions they believe are lightly defended. The tactical doctrine is pure Japanese infantry assault: speed, shock, overwhelming the enemy before they can organize effective resistance. What Ichiki doesn't know is that Marines have spent 2 weeks preparing for exactly this kind of attack. Defensive positions are fully manned. Fields of fire are clear and interlocking. Artillery has ranges calculated to every likely approach. The Japanese column walks into a killing zone more lethal than anything Ichiki encountered in China or Southeast Asia campaigns. Marines hold fire until Japanese troops reach the creek, until the lead elements are committed to crossing, and the column is strung out in perfect enfilade. Then Cates orders weapons free. Rifles, machine guns, mortars, artillery all open simultaneously. The effect is devastating. Japanese infantry caught in the open, wading through waist-deep water, unable to maneuver or find cover. The assault stalls in minutes. Bodies pile up in the creek itself. Survivors attempt to withdraw, but Marine counter-battery fire follows them. Artillery observers calling in corrections with calm precision. By 0320, 20 minutes into the engagement, Ichiki's regiment has lost more than 300 troops and gained 0 ground. The colonel realizes with horror that American forces are neither weak nor disorganized. They're entrenched, supplied, and employing defensive tactics his training never prepared him to overcome. Dawn on August 21st reveals the slaughter's full extent. 600 Japanese bodies lie in and around Alligator Creek. Marine casualties number 19, killed, 27 wounded. The casualty ratio, 1 Marine for every 31 Japanese soldiers, reflects defensive advantages that will characterize the entire Guadalcanal campaign. Attackers must cross open ground under fire. Defenders occupy prepared positions with overlapping fields of fire. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasizes aggressive assault. Marine doctrine emphasizes disciplined defense. The combination produces engagements where Japanese forces suffer disproportionate losses while achieving minimal gains. Colonel Ichiki, facing the destruction of his regiment in a single night, commits suicide rather than report failure. His surviving troops scatter into the jungle, disorganized remnants that will spend weeks trying to regroup or reach Japanese-held territory. The psychological impact of Alligator Creek extends far beyond casualty figures. Marines who'd never experienced sustained combat discover they can not only fight, but win decisively against veteran Japanese troops. The uncertainty about American effectiveness, that lingering question about whether they could compete with enemy forces that had conquered half of Asia, begins dissolving in the confidence that comes from successful defense. Simultaneously, Japanese command at Rabaul receives reports that shatter their assumptions about Guadalcanal's ease of recapture. If an entire regiment can be destroyed, attacking American positions, then the garrison is neither weak nor on the verge of collapse. Recapturing the island will require resources and planning on an entirely different scale than originally calculated. Marine defensive tactics evolve through each engagement. Lessons learned from Alligator Creek immediately incorporated into doctrine, interlocking fields of firework, pre-planned artillery responses work, disciplined fire control, waiting until targets are committed before opening up. All works brutally well. Battalion commanders begin documenting these lessons in after-action reports that get circulated throughout the division. The learning process accelerates because failure means death, success means survival, and the feedback loop operates at combat speed rather than peacetime training pace. By September, Marine positions around Henderson Field represent the most sophisticated defensive network any American unit has constructed in World War II. Every approach is covered. Every strong point supports adjacent positions. Artillery can reach any point where enemy forces might concentrate. Henderson Field becomes operational for fighter aircraft on August 20th, one day before Alligator Creek Battle. N-19 Grumman F-4 F Wildcats and 12 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers land on the runway that Marines have named after a pilot killed at Midway. The presence of American aircraft transforms Guadalcanal's strategic equation overnight. Japanese ships can no longer approach during daylight without risking air attack. Supply runs must happen at night, limiting cargo capacity and increasing vulnerability to American naval interdiction. Most critically, Henderson Field provides the air cover that Admiral Fletcher's carriers couldn't sustain, making the island defensible through American air superiority during daylight hours, even while Japanese Navy controls surrounding waters after dark. The airfield Japan built becomes the weapon that prevents Japan from retaking the island, irony that defines the campaign's entire strategic logic. August 20th, 1942, 14:30 hours. The drone of aircraft engines brings every Marine at Henderson Field scrambling for cover. 19 Grumman F, 4F, Wildcats sit in hastily prepared revetments, fuel trucks still servicing them after the landing 30 minutes earlier. Then someone points skyward and the realization spreads. Those aren't Japanese bombers. Those are the bombers. But our fighters are already airborne. Marine Air Group 23 had launched 4 Wildcats on combat air patrol the moment they landed. Veteran pilots, understanding that Henderson Field would become target the instant Japanese reconnaissance spotted American aircraft. Now, those 4 planes climbed toward 35 Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers approaching from Rabaul, 560 miles to the northwest. Not executing the strike mission that Japanese command launched as soon as Coast Watchers reported aircraft landing at Guadalcanal. The air combat that follows demonstrates both American disadvantage and American determination. F-4, F Wildcats are outperformed by Japanese Zero fighters in nearly every category. The Zero climbs faster, turns tighter, reaches higher altitude. Zeros protecting the bomber formation engage American fighters with confidence born from 6 months of uncontested superiority. But Wildcat pilots employ tactics that compensate for aircraft limitations. Boom and zoom. Dive from altitude, fire a burst. Extend away using superior diving speed and armor protection. Never turn fight. Never try to match Zero maneuverability. The engagements are brief, violent, and surprisingly effective. 3 Betty bombers go down on the approach. 2 more sustain damage severe enough that they'll crash before reaching Rabaul. The strike proceeds with diminished effectiveness, bombs falling across Henderson Field, but hitting no critical targets because Marines scattered to foxholes and revetments protected aircraft. August 14th brings the real test of Henderson Field's defensive capability. Japanese launch 24 G4M bombers escorted by 15 Zeros, intending to destroy American fighter strength on the ground before it becomes serious threat. The raid arrives at midday, visibility perfect, bombing conditions ideal. But Marine ground controllers have established rudimentary early warning network using coast watchers stationed on islands between Guadalcanal and Rabaul. The warning comes 90 minutes before bombers arrive, in time enough for every Wildcat to scramble and gain altitude. The air battle develops at 15,000 feet. 8 American fighters engaging 39 Japanese aircraft, with odds that should be suicidal. Instead, Marine pilots demonstrate that training and determination can overcome numerical disadvantage when tactics are sound and pilots are willing to risk everything. Major John L. Smith becomes the first Marine pilot to score confirmed kill over Henderson Field, his 450 caliber machine guns shredding the wing root of a Betty bomber that explodes in midair. Smith radios "Splash 1 Betty" and immediately dives away from the Zero, pursuing him, using Wildcat's superior roll rate to break the enemy's attack solution. The doctrine is emerging through combat experience. Wildcats can't dogfight Zeros, but they can survive engagements by exploiting the advantages they possess: armor protection that allows absorbing hits without critical damage, diving speed that lets them escape when overwhelmed, and structural strength that permits violent maneuvers Zeros can't match without risking structural failure. The exchange rate tilts in America's favor despite Japanese technical superiority. 6 bombers destroyed for loss of 4 Wildcats, and the American pilots who bail out land inside friendly lines where they can return to combat. Japanese aircrew who survive bailout become prisoners or die in the jungle. The strategic implications of Henderson Field's survival reshape Japanese planning for Guadalcanal. As long as American aircraft operate from the island, daylight belongs to Allied forces. Supply ships can unload under air cover. Even reinforcements can land with fighter protection overhead. Japanese cannot mount naval operations during daylight hours without accepting catastrophic air attack losses. The war becomes divided into day and night. Daylight, and American air superiority makes waters around Guadalcanal deadly for Japanese shipping. Darkness, Japanese Navy controls surface with fast cruisers and destroyers. The Tokyo Express runs that will define naval combat for next 4 months. Both sides adapt tactics to this divided battlefield, fighting separate wars that happen to occur in same geographic space. Aircraft performance statistics reveal why Guadalcanal becomes proving ground for American fighter doctrine. F-4 F Wildcats cruise at 203 miles per hour, mount 450 caliber machine guns, possess combat radius of approximately 100 miles. Elite Zeros cruise at 331 miles per hour, mount 2 20mm cannon and 2 7.7mm machine guns, operate at combat radius exceeding 200 miles. On paper, Zeros dominate every category except diving speed and armored protection. In practice, Marine pilots discover that combat happens in 3 dimensions, where altitude advantage and tactical patience matter more than aircraft specifications. Wildcats diving from 20,000 feet reach speeds where Zeros cannot follow without structural damage. Armor plate behind pilot seats means Wildcats routinely return from combat with dozens of bullet holes, pilots uninjured, aircraft repairable. Zeros lack armor because weight savings improve performance, but this choice means a single burst of 50 caliber fire often proves fatal. Henderson Field. Characteristics constrain operations in ways that Marine pilots must work around creatively. The runway measures 2,600 feet, adequate for fighters but marginal for loaded bombers. Revetments protect 40 aircraft maximum, forcing maintenance crews to service planes in the open where they're vulnerable to air raids. Ammunition stocks are limited, requiring pilots to conserve rounds and make every burst count. Fuel arrives irregularly, depending on whether supply ships can reach the island, sometimes forcing aircraft to be grounded for days while waiting for tankers. Living conditions for pilots and ground crew are primitive even by Marine standards. Tents pitched in coconut groves, rations consisting mostly of captured Japanese rice, supplemented by sporadic American supplies, malaria, dysentery, zootropical infections afflicting personnel at rates that reduce effective strength by 20% monthly. Major Joe Foss, who will become leading Marine ace of Guadalcanal campaign, describes the daily routine in letters that survive. Wake at dawn, pre-flight inspection of aircraft that's probably damaged from previous days' combat or bombing, breakfast of rice and coffee, briefing on expected Japanese air activity based on Coast Watcher reports, scramble when bombers inbound, climb to altitude while ground crews track formations with binoculars, engage bombers, evade escorts, try to survive long enough to shoot down enemy aircraft, land with fuel gauge reading empty, repair battle damage, repeat tomorrow. The routine's monotony masks constant danger. Every mission risks death or injury. Every landing on rough coral runway risks structural failure. Every gallon of fuel consumed is one less available for next mission. Yet, Foss and his fellow pilots fly continuously, understanding that Henderson Field's survival depends on maintaining air superiority during daylight hours, when supply ships are most vulnerable. Japanese air operations from Rabaul face limitations that gradually erode their effectiveness. Distance from Rabaul to Guadalcanal, 560 miles, places target at extreme range for bomber operations. G4M. Betty bombers burn most of their fuel reaching the target, leaving minimal loiter time over Henderson Field. Zeros escorting them face same constraints, forced to choose between protecting bombers during approach or saving fuel for engagement and return flight. The mathematics of attrition work against Japanese. Every bomber shot down represents trained crew lost, aircraft that takes months to replace. Every zero destroyed means one less experienced pilot. Japan's industrial base cannot replace losses as rapidly as America's. By mid-August, Japanese air strength at Rabaul consists of approximately 150 aircraft, but only 35 to 50 are available for daily operations against Guadalcanal. Mechanical issues, pilot fatigue, fuel shortages, and combat losses create persistent shortfall between aircraft on inventory and aircraft mission capable. American reinforcement of Henderson Field proceeds whenever ships can safely approach. Additional Wildcats arrive via carrier deck launches, the pilots flying maximum range missions to reach Guadalcanal, then joining MAG-23 permanently. SBD Dauntless dive bombers provide offensive capability, aircraft that can attack Japanese shipping or support ground operations. By August 20th, Henderson Field reports 47 operational aircraft, number that fluctuates daily based on combat losses and mechanical attrition. The critical threshold is 30 fighters, minimum necessary to maintain continuous combat air patrol and respond to air raids. When operational strength drops below 30, Henderson Field becomes vulnerable to concentrated Japanese bombing that could destroy remaining aircraft on ground. When strength exceeds 50, Americans can mount offensive operations beyond immediate defensive needs. The balance shifts back and forth throughout August, as both sides feed aircraft into attrition battle, where replacement rate determines who holds air superiority. The psychological impact on Japanese air crews becomes evident in intelligence reports compiled from interrogations of prisoners. Pilots accustomed to operating without significant opposition suddenly face determined defense. Bomber formations that routinely struck targets without loss now absorb casualties on every mission. The narrative of Japanese invincibility, reinforced by 6 months of victories, begins eroding under sustained combat, where American fighters demonstrate they can compete effectively despite technical disadvantages. Zero pilots report that American tactics are improving. Yes, that Wildcats no longer attempt suicidal turning engagements, but instead employ hit-and-run techniques that play to their strengths. The assessment is correct. Marine pilots are learning faster than Japanese command anticipated. Accelerated evolution, driven by survival necessity and immediate feedback when tactics fail. August 24th, 1942, 2100 hours. Darkness over the slot. That passage of water between Solomon Islands chains conceals 8 Japanese destroyers steaming south at 30 knots. They carry 1,500 troops of the Kawaguchi Brigade, elite infantry being rushed to Guadalcanal after Ichiki Regiment's destruction proved that recapturing the island requires more than single regiment assaults. The destroyers are configured as fast transports. The main battery ammunition, reduced to make room for soldiers packed into every available space. This is the Tokyo Express, the supply system Japanese Navy developed to exploit their night fighting superiority and American inability to contest waters around Guadalcanal after darkness. The express runs will deliver reinforcements, supplies, and naval gunfire support, while withdrawing before dawn brings American air attacks from Henderson Field. American destroyer screen detects the approaching formation just after midnight. Radar operators aboard USS Blue report multiple contacts closing from the northwest, speed and bearing consistent with enemy warships. Admiral McCain, commanding Allied air forces in the South Pacific, immediately launches strike aircraft from Enterprise and Saratoga, despite the risks of night carrier operations. The engagement that develops over the next 6 hours becomes Battle of Eastern Solomons, carrier aircraft attacking Japanese surface forces, while cruisers and destroyers maneuver for advantageous positions. Japanese lose heavy cruiser Kinugasa heavily damaged, light cruiser Jinsu with fires raging through superstructure, and destroyer Mutsuki sunk by dive bombers that catch her withdrawing at dawn. The Express delivers its troops, but at cost that makes Japanese command question whether this approach is sustainable. September 3rd brings the largest Tokyo Express run yet attempted. 6 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers carry more than 1,000 troops, plus artillery pieces, anti-aircraft guns, and ammunition stockpiles sufficient to sustain major offensive operations. The convoy approaches Guadalcanal at dusk, timing calculated to allow unloading during darkness, then withdrawal before Henderson Field aircraft can respond. But Coast Watchers spotted the formation leaving Shortland Islands, and American intelligence tracks them throughout the day. Wildcats and Dauntless dive bombers launch from Henderson Field at maximum range, reaching the convoy just as it enters the slot. The air attacks force Japanese ships to scatter, delaying the landing schedule and ensuring that Marines receive warning of reinforcements arriving. The Tokyo Express represents tactical brilliance constrained by strategic limitations. Japanese cruisers capable of 30-plus knots can make Rabaul to Guadalcanal run in single night, arriving after sunset and departing before dawn. Speed provides safety, darkness provides concealment. But cargo capacity becomes the limiting factor. Destroyers configured as fast transports carry 150 to 200 troops maximum. Even large runs delivering 1,000 soldiers require multiple ships operating in coordination, increasing vulnerability and reducing the stealth that makes express runs survivable. More critically, destroyers hauling troops cannot simultaneously carry supplies in sufficient quantity. Each run must choose between delivering personnel or delivering food and ammunition. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal grow numerically stronger while supply situation deteriorates. Admiral Raizo Tanaka commands most Tokyo Express operations from his flagship, heavy cruiser Jinsu. Tanaka represents Japanese naval excellence, a career officer whose night fighting expertise makes him ideal for these high-risk missions. His ships operate with precision that American forces cannot match in 1942. Formation discipline so tight that vessels maintain station even in complete darkness. Torpedo firing doctrine that launches spreads calculated to overwhelm evasive maneuvers. Damage control procedures honed through years of training. Tanaka's force executes night operations that American Navy won't match until 1943, after implementing radar fire control and new tactical doctrines. But even excellence cannot overcome mathematics. Every express run costs fuel oil Japan struggles to replace. Every engagement risks ships Japan cannot quickly build. The attrition is sustainable only if Guadalcanal can be recaptured quickly enough to justify the investment. Japanese resupply runs achieve varying degrees of success through August and September. Night of August 28th, 4 destroyers land 900 troops without incident. September 4th, 3 cruisers deliver artillery battery and ammunition, losing 1 destroyer to submarine attack during withdrawal. September 14th, 6 destroyers evacuate sick and wounded, while simultaneously landing fresh troops. The operations demonstrate Japanese capability for complex naval maneuvers under difficult conditions. But cumulative effectiveness falls short of requirements. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal receive intermittent reinforcement, while supply deliveries remain inadequate to sustain combat operations. Marines calculate that each express run delivers perhaps 50 tons of supplies, while their daily consumption under combat conditions exceeds 70 tons. The deficit compounds weekly. American Navy's inability to stop Tokyo Express becomes source of frustration that drives doctrinal innovation. Surface radar provides detection capability, but not engagement advantage when Japanese forces execute coordinated torpedo attacks from beyond American visual range. Night air operations remain too dangerous for routine use. Submarine patrols achieve occasional successes, but cannot maintain continuous coverage. The fundamental problem is that American surface forces optimized for daytime gunnery engagements cannot defeat Japanese forces optimized for night torpedo combat. Admiral Halsey, who will replace Gormley as South Pacific Commander in October, and recognizes that stopping the Express requires either accepting night battles on Japanese terms or establishing air superiority so complete that Express runs cannot operate even in darkness. Both approaches require capabilities that American forces won't possess for months. The strategic calculus from Japanese perspective grows increasingly pessimistic through September. Ichiki Regiment destroyed. Kawaguchi Brigade suffering heavy casualties and ground attacks. Air losses over Henderson Field mounting to unsustainable levels. Express runs delivering troops but at cost in ships and fuel that strains logistics network extending back to Rabaul. Imperial General Headquarters faces choice between committing additional resources to recapturing Guadalcanal or accepting the island as loss and consolidating defensive positions farther north. The decision to escalate, to commit fleet strength and additional army divisions, reflects Japanese assessment that losing Guadalcanal would create gap in defensive perimeter that Americans could exploit. But escalation requires resources that might be better employed elsewhere, creating opportunity costs that will haunt Japanese strategy for remainder of war. Marine defensive positions absorb Japanese reinforcements with growing confidence. Each express run brings more enemy troops, but those troops arrive without adequate supplies or heavy weapons. Japanese soldiers land on Guadalcanal after harrowing night voyage, facing immediate combat without proper preparation or logistical support. American forces, meanwhile, receive sporadic but meaningful reinforcement via ships that can approach during daylight under Henderson Field air cover. By September, Marine strength on island exceeds 22,000 troops, with supply stockpiles sufficient for sustained operations. The balance tilts slowly but steadily toward American advantage, not through brilliant tactics or decisive engagements, but through capacity to sustain operations while Japanese logistics deteriorate. Naval losses from Tokyo Express operations accumulate through autumn. Japanese destroyers sunk, Mutsuki, Udachi, Akatsuki. Cruisers damaged: Kinugasa, Jinsu, Furutaka. American losses similarly mount: destroyers Duncan, Porter, Meredith sunk. Cruisers damage in night engagements where radar advantage means nothing against Type 93 torpedoes launched from beyond visual range. The mutual attrition creates naval graveyard at bottom of Ironbottom Sound, and that stretch of water between Guadalcanal and Tulagi, where 49 Allied and Japanese warships will sink before campaign ends. Each side feeds vessels into meat grinder of night combat, each believing that persistence will eventually exhaust enemies' capacity to continue. Both are correct. Both are wrong about their own sustainability. The Tokyo Express becomes symbol of Japanese determination and Japanese limitations simultaneously. Determination, continuing operations despite mounting losses, accepting risk to deliver reinforcements that might enable recapture of strategically critical island. Limitations: delivering troops without adequate supplies, fighting logistics battle while losing industrial capacity to replace losses, at committing irreplaceable destroyer strength to mission that achieves tactical success without strategic victory. By October, express runs have delivered approximately 10,000 Japanese troops to Guadalcanal, but those troops are undersupplied, inadequately supported by artillery or armor, fighting without naval gunfire support during daylight hours, when American air power makes Japanese surface operations suicidal. The numbers favor Japan, but the sustainability favors America, and time will prove which advantage matters more. August 21st, 1942, 0300 hours. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki leads his regiment across Alligator Creek, convinced that Marine defenses will collapse under determined assault. Japanese infantry doctrine emphasizes shock and aggression, all principles that proved devastatingly effective in China and Southeast Asia. But Ichiki has not fought American Marines before, has not faced defensive positions where every approach is covered by interlocking fields of fire, where artillery coordinates with machine guns to create killing zones that turn aggressive assault into mass suicide. The engagement lasts 20 minutes. When ceasefire is called, 600 Japanese soldiers lie dead in and around the creek. Marine casualties: 35 killed and wounded combined. The casualty ratio, 1 American for every 17 Japanese, reveals something fundamental about the tactical balance on Guadalcanal. Japanese attacks face defenders who have learned, who have adapted, who have evolved doctrine that punishes aggression with mechanical efficiency. The tactical lessons from Alligator Creek spread through Marine positions within hours. After-action reports circulate to every battalion commander, specific details about what worked and why. Interlocking fields of fire prevented infiltration. Pre-planned artillery responses destroyed attacking formations before they reached defensive wire. Fire discipline, waiting until enemy committed to assault before opening weapons, maximized effectiveness of each volley. Japanese tendency to attack at night played into Marine advantages, darkness concealing defensive positions, while searchlights and flares illuminated attackers. Battalion commanders incorporate these lessons immediately, refining defensive layouts and response procedures. The learning curve is steep because lessons come written in casualties. Failure means death. Success means survival. September 13th through 14th brings Japanese 35th Brigade assault on Edson's Ridge, subsequently known as Bloody Ridge for obvious reasons. General Kiyotake Kawaguchi commands 6,000 troops attacking hilltop position held by 840 Marines of 1st Raider Battalion and 1st Parachute Battalion. The tactical situation seems to favor Japanese forces. Numerical superiority of 7-1. Night attack, where Japanese excelled. Elevated terrain that should allow attackers to descend on defenders from multiple directions. But Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson has prepared his positions with obsessive attention to defensive fundamentals. Every avenue of approach is covered. Artillery has pre-registered targets on likely assembly areas. The mortars can reach anywhere attackers might concentrate. Reserves are positioned to counterattack penetrations before they can exploit success. The battle unfolds across 2 nights of sustained combat. Japanese assault waves attack repeatedly, sometimes achieving initial penetration of Marine lines before counterattacks restore positions. Edson moves constantly along the defensive perimeter, personally directing responses to each threat. His command style reflects Marine Corps doctrine. Leaders lead from front. Officers share danger with enlisted men. Courage is demonstrated rather than commanded. The example holds the position when rational calculation suggests withdrawal would be prudent. By dawn on September 15th, Kawaguchi's brigade has suffered 2,000 casualties. Marine losses, 143 killed and wounded. But the casualty ratio has improved to 1 Marine for every 14 Japanese, reflecting doctrinal evolution that makes American defensive positions increasingly lethal even against superior numbers. Marine tactical advantages accumulate through small improvements that compound into overwhelming superiority. Better communication between infantry companies and artillery batteries. Improved coordination between machine gun positions that creates overlapping coverage with no dead zones. Enhanced discipline about ammunition's conservation. Avoiding panic fire in favor of aimed shots. Integration of captured Japanese weapons into defensive plans. Using enemy machine guns and mortars when American equivalents are in short supply. Every innovation responds to specific failure identified in previous engagement, creating feedback loop where doctrine evolves continuously based on combat results rather than peacetime assumptions. Japanese tactical rigidity becomes glaring weakness when matched against Marine adaptability. Imperial Army doctrine was refined through campaigns in China where enemy forces lacked equivalent firepower and defensive sophistication. Night attacks worked against Chinese troops who lacked night fighting equipment and doctrine. Aggressive frontal assaults succeeded when enemy withdrew rather than accepting close combat. But Marines don't withdraw. Marines occupy positions prepared for exactly these tactics. Positions where Japanese aggression becomes liability rather than asset. The doctrinal mismatch produces casualty ratios so disproportionate that Japanese commanders question whether their tactics require fundamental revision. That question remains largely unanswered through Guadalcanal campaign. Japanese command continuing to order attacks that consume irreplaceable infantry strength while achieving minimal gains. Captured documents from Bloody Ridge reveal Japanese strategic calculations that are startlingly incorrect. Intelligence estimates claim American forces number perhaps 3,000 troops, when actual strength exceeds 22,000. Supply assessments suggest Marines are on verge of starvation, when captured Japanese rations prove that enemy supply situation is far more desperate than American. Morale evaluations predict American collapse under pressure. When every engagement demonstrates that Marine determination is hardening rather than eroding. These intelligence failures compound tactical mistakes, creating Japanese offensive operations based on assumptions that bear minimal resemblance to battlefield realities. The consequence is attacks that are courageously executed but strategically futile. Equipment comparisons show that Japanese infantry lack critical capabilities that Marines possess. American M1917 water-cooled machine guns maintain sustained fire rates that Japanese Type 92 machine guns cannot match. Marine mortar crews have developed firing techniques that deliver rounds with accuracy Japanese crews struggle to achieve. American rifle ammunition is superior in quality and consistency. More importantly, Marines have supply chains that deliver ammunition and replacement weapons regularly, while Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fight with decreasing ammunition stocks that force rationing even during major engagements. The material advantage combines with tactical superiority to create situations where Japanese attacks are defeated not through heroism, but through systematic application of firepower, supported by adequate logistics. Medical statistics reveal another dimension of Marine advantage. Wounded Marines receive treatment from corpsmen, trained specifically for combat medicine. Evacuation procedures move casualties from front lines to aid stations within hours. Serious cases are transported to hospital ships offshore or to rear area facilities in New Caledonia. Mortality rate among wounded Marines is approximately 15%. Japanese wounded receive minimal medical treatment under combat conditions. Evacuation is impossible because express runs focus on delivering reinforcements rather than extracting casualties. Medicine and supplies are inadequate. Mortality among Japanese wounded probably exceeds 50%. The difference means that Marine units maintain effectiveness even after sustaining casualties, while Japanese units become combat ineffective at much lower casualty rates. Psychological resilience proves equally important as tactical skill. Marines holding defensive positions understand they are participating in the first American offensive of the war. Failure means validating Japanese propaganda about Western decadence. Success means proving that American forces can compete with enemy troops who have conquered half of Asia. That knowledge creates determination that survives hunger, disease, exhaustion, and fear. Japanese troops, conversely, increasingly question what they're fighting for as casualty rates mount without achieving recapture of Henderson Field. Letters and diaries recovered from Japanese casualties reveal soldiers who began campaign confident of quick victory, now doubting whether any victory is possible. The morale differential compounds all other advantages Marines possess. Training evolution happens in real time as experienced veterans share lessons with newly arrived replacements. Old hands explain that Japanese bayonet charges are terrifying but ineffective against disciplined fire. Veterans demonstrate proper procedure for repelling infiltration attempts. Double combat experienced Marines train newcomers in night fighting techniques that American doctrine barely addressed in peacetime. The institutional knowledge accumulates, creating force that becomes more capable as campaign progresses rather than deteriorating under attrition's pressure. Japanese forces experience opposite trajectory. Veteran troops being killed faster than replacements can absorb necessary skills. Unit cohesion declining as casualties mount. By October, Marine battalions that landed in August are more effective despite casualties than Japanese brigades that arrived at full strength in September. The difference reflects sustainable tactical excellence versus unsustainable courage. Mid-September 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto convenes fleet conference aboard his flagship at Truk Anchorage, gathering every senior naval officer in combined fleet to address the crisis that Guadalcanal has become. The meeting's atmosphere reflects 6 weeks of frustration. Ichiki Regiment destroyed. Kawaguchi Brigade bled white on Bloody Ridge. Air losses over Henderson Field, exceeding replacement capacity. Express runs delivering troops, but not supplies in sufficient quantity. The piecemeal reinforcement strategy has failed. Yamamoto presents the alternative. Commit main fleet strength to Guadalcanal in coordinated operation that destroys American naval forces and breaks Marine defensive perimeter. Operation KA, scheduled for mid-October, will be combined fleet's decisive attempt to settle Guadalcanal through overwhelming force rather than incremental pressure. The strategic logic rests on Japanese assessment of American carrier strength. All Enterprise damaged at Eastern Solomons. Wasp sunk by submarine, September 15th. Hornet remains operational, but presumably weakened from months of sustained operations. Yamamoto believes that committing battleships Haruna and Kongo, plus carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, and Hio, will achieve numerical superiority sufficient to destroy American carrier forces and gain control of waters around Guadalcanal. Without carrier protection, American supply ships cannot approach. Without supply, Marines cannot sustain defensive operations. The island will fall not through frontal assault, but through siege that starves defenders into submission. The plan is methodical, logical, dependent on accurate intelligence about American carrier disposition. That intelligence will prove catastrophically wrong, but in September, Japanese confidence remains unshaken. September 24th, 1942. Japanese fleet departs Truk staging area, battleships and carriers steaming south in formation that demonstrates combined fleet's remaining strength. 2 battleships, 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 8 destroyers, 1 seaplane tender, and 4 fleet carriers represent investment that Japan cannot afford to lose. The operation plan calls for coordinated ground offensive by 17th Army divisions attacking Henderson Field perimeter, while naval forces engage American carriers and surface units. If ground forces break through Marine defenses, if naval forces destroy American carrier strength, Guadalcanal falls and the entire campaign's cost is justified. If operation fails, if casualties mount without achieving objectives, then Guadalcanal becomes indefensible liability, draining resources needed elsewhere. The fleet proceeding south carries Japan's strategic future in its magazines. American codebreakers at Station Hypo detect unusual communications traffic, suggesting major Japanese fleet movement. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding Pacific Fleet, orders immediate concentration of available carrier strength near Guadalcanal. Enterprise, hastily repaired after Eastern Solomon's damage, sortie from Pearl Harbor with replacement aircraft and pilots. Hornet, operating in South Pacific, receives orders to rendezvous with Enterprise northeast of Guadalcanal. The American response will muster 2 carriers against 4 Japanese fleet carriers, numerical disadvantage that seems overwhelming until you factor in American intelligence advantage. Japanese forces don't know that Americans have broken their naval codes. Japanese commanders believe they're achieving surprise when actually they're sailing into engagement where enemy knows their composition, objectives, and timeline. October 11th, 1942. Japanese and American fleets converge on waters northeast of Guadalcanal. Reconnaissance aircraft from both sides detect enemy formations, triggering launch sequences that will send hundreds of aircraft toward targets beyond visual range. This is carrier warfare as theorists imagined it, fleets engaging at distances measured in hundreds of miles, victory determined by aircraft rather than guns. But theory didn't account for how chaotic these engagements would become, how difficult coordinating strikes across vast distances while dodging enemy air attacks, how quickly tactical advantage could evaporate through navigation errors or communication failures. The Battle of Santa Cruz will demonstrate that carrier combat is less decisive and more attritional than either side expected. Yamamoto's personal signal to combined fleet emphasizes the stakes. The fate of the empire rests on this battle. The dramatic language reflects genuine strategic assessment. If Guadalcanal can be recaptured, Japanese defensive perimeter holds and war becomes attritional stalemate that might eventually produce negotiated peace favorable to Japan. If Guadalcanal is lost, if American forces establish forward base from which they can threaten Rabaul and subsequent positions, then Japanese defensive depth collapses and war becomes series of retreats toward inevitable defeat. Yamamoto understands this. His staff understands this. The burden of expectation weighs on every commander preparing for battle. Victory means validating 6 months of sacrifice. Defeat means acknowledging that all those losses were in vain. Japanese confidence level reflects intelligence assessments that dramatically underestimate American carrier strength and pilot quality. Reports suggest Enterprise is still damaged, operating at reduced capacity. Hornet is believed near end of operational cycle, worn down from continuous combat. Pilot quality is assessed as inferior based on early war engagements, where Japanese veterans dominated inexperienced American aviators. These assumptions inform battle planning that expects Japanese strike aircraft will destroy American carriers before counterstrike inflicts equivalent damage. The calculations are reasonable based on available intelligence. They're also wrong. Enterprise is damaged but operational. Hornet is fatigued but combat capable. American pilots are increasingly experienced, many having rotated through Guadalcanal, where they learned hard lessons about surviving combat against superior Japanese aircraft. American command assessment of Japanese fleet strength comes from signals intelligence that reveals composition, course, and intended objectives. Admiral Halsey, newly appointed South Pacific commander, understands he's outnumbered, but possesses critical advantage that Japanese lack: knowledge of enemy plans. American carriers can position themselves optimally for first strike, while Japanese search for targets based on estimated positions. All American combat air patrol can be concentrated, where Japanese attack is most likely rather than dispersed across theoretical threat axes. These advantages don't eliminate numerical disadvantage, but they create tactical opportunities that, properly executed, might produce favorable outcomes, despite unfavorable odds. Halsey's orders to Task Force 61 are characteristically aggressive. Attack, repeat, attack. The build-up to Santa Cruz reveals fundamental difference in how both navies approach carrier operations. Japanese doctrine emphasizes mass strikes, launching every available aircraft simultaneously to overwhelm enemy defenses. American doctrine emphasizes flexibility, launching strikes in waves that maintain continuous pressure while preserving reserve strength. Japanese aircraft are superior but fragile, those Zeros lacking armor and self-sealing fuel tanks that make damage survivable. American aircraft are inferior but robust, Wildcats and Dauntless bombers absorbing punishment that would destroy Japanese equivalents. The operational philosophies reflect national characteristics and industrial capabilities. Japan builds for excellence, knowing replacements will be difficult. America builds for sustainability, knowing losses can be replaced. Which approach proves superior will be determined by which side can sustain operations longest. Naval aviation logistics constrain both fleets in ways that will determine engagement parameters. Japanese carriers operating from truck must refuel and rearm at advanced bases, limiting operational tempo. American carriers operating from Espiritu Santo and New Caledonia face similar constraints. Neither fleet can sustain continuous operations. Battles must be decisive because follow-up engagements might be impossible if fuel or ammunition run low. This creates pressure for both sides to achieve conclusive results in single engagement, attacking aggressively even when prudence might suggest withdrawal. The desperation produces brutal combat, where both fleets absorb damage neither can easily repair, setting stage for mutual exhaustion that will characterize Santa Cruz's outcome. October 26, 1942, dawn. Combat air patrol above USS. Hornet detects inbound Japanese aircraft on radar, massive formation approaching from northwest at 200 miles distance. The strike package launched from Shokaku and Zuikaku 90 minutes earlier consists of 64 dive bombers, 40 torpedo bombers, and 32 Zero fighters, 196 aircraft executing coordinated attack that represents combined fleet's maximum offensive capability. American carriers respond by launching every available fighter, 20 Wildcats climbing desperately to intercept attackers before they reach task force. The mathematics are overwhelming. 20 fighters against 196 attackers means that even perfect interception will allow most Japanese aircraft to reach targets. The defense won't stop the attack. It can only attenuate it, destroy enough attackers that surviving aircraft inflict manageable rather than catastrophic damage. 9-15 hours. Aichi D-3A dive bombers roll into attack on Hornet. screaming down from 15,000 feet in near vertical dives that American anti-aircraft gunners struggle to track. The first bomb hits forward of the island superstructure, penetrating flight deck and exploding in hangar spaces where aircraft are fueled and armed. Secondary explosions rip through the hangar, fires spreading faster than damage control parties can contain them. Subsequent hits strike aft, midships, and along the flight deck. Within 5 minutes, Hornet is burning from bow to stern, fires consuming aircraft, aviation fuel, and ammunition in conflagration that sends smoke column visible for 50 miles. Captain Charles Mason orders counter-flooding to prevent capsizing, but internal communications are severed. Damage control, coordination collapses, and fires rage beyond any hope of control. 940 hours. Enterprise, positioned 8 miles from Hornet, becomes next target as Japanese aircraft identify the second American carrier. Enterprise's combat air patrol has been decimated protecting Hornet. Only 6 Wildcats remaining to intercept 90 Japanese aircraft converging from multiple vectors. Dive bombers score 3 hits on Enterprise's flight deck, bombs penetrating into crew spaces where sailors die by dozens as blast effect and fragmentation sweep through confined areas. 50 killed instantly, hundreds wounded, but damage control procedures prove more effective than Hornet's response. Fire parties contain blazes. Engineering spaces maintain power. Flight deck damage is isolated enough that recovery operations might continue if surviving aircraft can be guided safely aboard. Enterprise survives but is effectively mission killed, incapable of launching strikes and barely capable of recovering aircraft. 10 to 20 hours. American counterstrikes launched before Japanese attack arrived now reach enemy carriers. 24 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet spot Japanese carrier Zuiho and execute textbook attack. Bombs strike flight deck and superstructure, explosions starting fires that force Zuiho to withdraw from operations. The damage isn't fatal, but it's sufficient to eliminate Zuiho from battle, reducing Japanese operational carrier strength by 25%. Subsequent American strikes target Shokaku, scoring hits that damage flight deck and destroy aircraft. Shokaku can still operate but at reduced capacity, her ability to launch and recover aircraft constrained by battle damage. The exchange is brutal for both sides. Americans lose Hornet as functional carrier. Japanese lose operational capability from Zuiho and Shokaku. The battle is consuming carrier strength faster than either fleet anticipated. 1050 hours. Hornet's situation deteriorates beyond salvage. Fires have spread throughout the ship, despite heroic damage control efforts. List is increasing as counterflooding creates stability problems worse than fire damage. Captain Mason orders abandoned ship, destroyer Mustin coming alongside to evacuate crew, while other destroyers attempt to scuttle burning Hulk before Japanese surface forces can claim the prize. Torpedoes strike Hornet's hull repeatedly, but the carrier refuses to sink. Fires still burning, but buoyancy somehow maintained. Eventually, Japanese destroyers finish what American torpedoes couldn't, sending Hornet to the bottom with 900 crew members already killed and ship herself destroyed beyond any hope of recovery. The loss represents America's newest fleet carrier, commissioned only 12 months earlier, destroyed in battle that achieved tactical stalemate rather than decisive victory either side expected. Casualty accounting reveals the engagement's attritional character. Americans lost, Hornet sunk, Enterprise severely damaged, 74 aircraft destroyed, 266 personnel killed. Japanese lost, Shokaku damaged, Zuiho damaged, 99 aircraft destroyed, equivalent personnel casualties. The exchange rate slightly favors Japan in immediate terms. They damage both American carriers while losing operational capacity from only 2 of their 4 engaged carriers. But strategic implications reverse tactical balance. America can replace losses. Enterprise will be repaired and returned to combat. New carriers are entering service from construction programs accelerated after Pearl Harbor. Japanese cannot replace losses at equivalent rate. Shokaku requires months of repair. Aircraft losses consume irreplaceable veteran pilots. Industrial base cannot produce replacement carriers fast enough to maintain fleet strength against American construction programs that will deliver dozens of new fleet carriers by 1944. Japanese post-battle assessment, later revealed through captured documents, shows combined fleet staff concluding that Americans can no longer threaten major operations. 2 carriers damaged or sunk, Enterprise barely operational. Pilot casualties suggesting American naval aviation is near breaking point. The assessment recommends consolidating gains, establishing defensive positions that assume American offensive capability is neutralized for at least 6 months. This conclusion will prove catastrophically wrong. American industrial mobilization is accelerating rather than contracting. Pilot training programs are producing aviators at rates that dwarf Japanese capacity. Carrier construction will deliver Saratoga, newly repaired, to theater within weeks, followed by Essex-class carriers that represent quantum improvement over previous designs. Japanese command mistakes temporary American weakness for permanent condition, making strategic decisions based on assumptions that will be invalidated within months. American command, despite losing Hornet, recognizes that Santa Cruz was strategic victory disguised as tactical defeat. Yes, they lost a carrier. Yes, Enterprise is damaged. But Japanese committed 4 fleet carriers and achieved only marginal advantage while absorbing irreplaceable losses in aircraft and pilots. The mathematics of attrition favor side that can replace losses faster, and American replacement capacity exponentially exceeds Japanese. Admiral Nimitz's assessment, filed within days of battle, notes that forcing Japan to expend carrier aircraft in inconclusive engagement serves American strategic interests. Every Japanese aircraft destroyed, every pilot killed, weakens combined fleet's capacity for future operations while American strength grows. The assessment is cold calculation that values industrial capacity over immediate tactical results. It's also correct. Pilot experience becomes critical variable that battle statistics don't fully capture. As Japanese aviators attacking American carriers are veterans with combat experience measured in years. American pilots defending their carriers are increasingly experienced but still averaging far fewer combat hours. Yet casualty rates among pilots suggest that American training is producing aviators who survive their initial combats and rapidly develop expertise that matches Japanese veterans. The differential in replacement rate matters more than differential in individual skill. Japan must preserve experienced pilots because training replacements takes years. America can afford to lose pilots and replace them with equally capable aviators within months. The sustainability equation favors America even when individual engagements favor Japan. Carrier aircraft losses at Santa Cruz foreshadow Pacific War's eventual outcome. Americans lost 74 aircraft, but will replace them within weeks. Japanese lost 99 aircraft and struggle to replace them within months. The industrial arithmetic is inexorable. American aircraft production in 1942 totals approximately 47,000 units. Japanese production totals approximately 8,000 units. By 1944, American production will exceed 100,000 aircraft annually, while Japanese production peaks below 30,000. These numbers mean that every carrier battle, every engagement where aircraft are destroyed, tilts long-term balance further toward America, even when short-term results seem inconclusive or unfavorable. Santa Cruz eliminated American carrier strength in South Pacific temporarily, but temporarily is the operative term. A Japanese carrier strength in Pacific is being eliminated permanently through attrition that cannot be reversed. October 28, 1942. High Command Conference in Tokyo brings together Army and Navy leadership to resolve strategic question that Guadalcanal has become. After Santa Cruz, both services recognize that piecemeal reinforcement has failed. Either commit overwhelming force sufficient to recapture the island definitively, or accept loss and redirect resources toward positions that can be defended successfully. Army argues for resource preservation. 3 divisions already committed to Guadalcanal operation. Casualties mounting into tens of thousands. Supply situation unsustainable. Continue bleeding divisions that might be deployed usefully elsewhere makes no strategic sense. Navy argues for escalation. Abandoning Guadalcanal creates gap in defensive perimeter that Americans will exploit, threatening Rabaul and eventually pushing towards Philippines. The debate reflects fundamental contradiction in Japanese strategic thinking. Resources are insufficient to hold everything, but abandoning anything creates vulnerabilities that might prove fatal. November 2nd brings compromise decision that satisfies neither service, but represents political necessity of maintaining joint Army-Navy cooperation. One final major reinforcement effort, delivering 17th Army Division plus supplies, to be executed November 11th through 12th. If operation succeeds, if Marines are driven from Henderson Field, island can be held. If operation fails, further reinforcement will be reconsidered. The decision commits significant resources while avoiding full commitment that might prove ruinous if operation goes wrong. Admiral Raizo Tanaka receives orders to assemble maximum strength express run, 13 destroyers and fast cruisers carrying 10,000 troops plus 40 days of ammunition, 60 days of food, artillery batteries, and anti-tank guns. The logistics are formidable. Loading that quantity of personnel and supplies while maintaining express run speed requires precise coordination that Tanaka's staff spends days planning. November 8th, 1942. Tanaka's force departs Shortland Islands under codename Rat Run 11, largest Tokyo Express operation attempted to date. 13 fast warships carry troops packed into every space, ammunition stored in magazines, supplies lashed to decks. The formation steams south at 28 knots, timing calculated to reach Guadalcanal after sunset on November 11th, unload through the night, withdraw before Henderson Field aircraft can attack at dawn. American aircraft spot the convoy immediately. Coast watchers report composition and heading. Henderson Field launches every available bomber, Marine, and Navy squadrons, attacking through the afternoon as Japanese ships approach the slot. The air attacks sink 2 destroyers and damage 3 others, forcing Tanaka to reduce speed and reorganize formation. The operation continues, but timing is disrupted. Unloading will happen after dawn rather than before, exposing ships to sustained air attack. November 11th, late evening. American battleships South Dakota and Washington, backed by 4 destroyers and cruisers Minneapolis, at Pensacola and New Orleans, position themselves between Guadalcanal and approaching Japanese force. Admiral Willis Lee commands American surface force with orders to stop express run, regardless of cost. The engagement that develops after midnight becomes First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Confused night action, where radar-directed American gunnery proves decisive for first time. South Dakota's 16-inch guns destroy Japanese destroyer Amagiri with single salvo. Washington's radar-directed fire cripples heavy cruiser Yubari. American destroyers engage Japanese surface units in close-range torpedo duels that sink USS Preston and USS Walke, while damaging Japanese destroyers Nagatsuki and Takanami. The battle is chaotic, violent, and ultimately decisive. Tanaka withdraws at 0200 hours without landing significant reinforcements. An American victory at First Naval Battle of Guadalcanal costs cruiser Juno, sunk by submarine during withdrawal with 700 casualties, including 5 brothers from same family. But Strategic impact is unambiguous. Largest Japanese reinforcement operation attempted since campaign began has been stopped cold. 10,000 troops that were supposed to land remain aboard damaged destroyers limping back to Shortland Islands. Supplies that were supposed to sustain major offensives site in ships' holds rather than ashore where Japanese forces desperately need them. The failure proves that American naval forces can contest waters around Guadalcanal even at night, that Japanese Tokyo Express runs no longer operate with impunity. That logistic situation for Japanese garrison will continue deteriorating. Tanaka's assessment, that's filed after First Naval Battle, acknowledges fundamental shift in naval balance. We were defeated not by individual ships, but by American gunfire control and radar. The admission is significant. Japanese night fighting excellence relied on superior training and Type 93 torpedoes giving range advantage. American radar fire control eliminates training advantage by allowing accurate gunnery without visual acquisition. South Dakota and Washington fired on targets they never saw, using radar returns to calculate firing solutions that achieved hits at ranges where Japanese lookouts couldn't detect American ships. Technology is negating Japanese tactical superiority, transforming night battles from arena where Japan dominates to contested battle space where advantages are neutralized. The implications extend beyond Guadalcanal. If America can develop doctrine that fully exploits radar capability, Japanese Navy's entire night fighting tradition becomes obsolete. Japanese command at Rabaul faces stark reality after November 12th. Express runs cannot reliably deliver supplies in sufficient quantity. Naval support cannot guarantee reinforcement will reach island. Ground forces already committed are undersupplied, understrength, facing Marine positions that grow stronger while Japanese positions weaken. The mathematics of attrition have reversed. Earlier in campaign, Japanese could sustain losses longer because their supply lines from Rabaul were secure, while American supply depended on vulnerable shipping. Now, American supply lines are secure because Henderson Field provides air cover during daylight. Japanese supply lines are interdicted constantly. Express runs suffering losses that accumulate faster than replacement ships arrive. The strategic position has inverted completely from August conditions. November 14th through 15th brings Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, follow-up engagement when Japanese attempt another express run with reduced force. 7 destroyers carry 3,000 troops and limited supplies, hoping to achieve through speed what overwhelming force couldn't accomplish. American destroyers intercept the formation, radar detecting approach and vectoring surface units into blocking positions. Battle of Tassafaronga, as it becomes known, sees American destroyer Northampton sunk by long lance torpedoes, while Japanese lose destroyers Takanami and have 5 other ships damaged. But the critical outcome is that only 2,000 of 3,000 troops actually land, and supplies delivered amount to approximately 30% of intended cargo. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal receive inadequate reinforcement that doesn't change tactical situation while losing ships that cannot be easily replaced. Cumulative naval losses through November reveal unsustainability of Japanese logistics strategy. Since August, Japan has lost 2 heavy cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 12 transports sunk or damaged beyond repair. American losses in same period: 7 destroyers, 1 cruiser sunk, several cruisers damaged. The exchange rate slightly favors Japan in capital ships, but dramatically favors America in sustainability. Japanese shipbuilding capacity cannot replace destroyer losses at rate they're being incurred. And American shipyards are delivering destroyers faster than they are being sunk. More critically, Japanese fuel oil consumption for express runs is draining reserves that cannot be replenished, given Allied submarine interdiction of tanker traffic from southern resource areas. Every express run, regardless of tactical outcome, consumes petroleum that cannot be replaced. The logistics arithmetic is killing Japanese capacity to sustain operations even when individual engagements produce favorable casualty exchange rates. Strategic reassessment within Imperial General Headquarters begins informally in mid-November, staff officers quietly questioning whether Guadalcanal can be held, given current loss rates. Army has committed 3 divisions plus supporting units, approximately 31,000 troops, of whom more than half are casualties or missing. Navy has expended irreplaceable destroyer strength in operations that achieved intermittent success without decisive results. Air losses over Henderson Field and surrounding waters exceed 800 aircraft with equivalent pilot casualties. Industrial capacity required to replace these losses exceeds what's available given competing demands from China theater, defense of home islands, and operations across Pacific. The unspoken conclusion is that Guadalcanal has become unwinnable, but admitting this requires acknowledging that 6 months of sacrifice achieved nothing except demonstrating American capacity to win attritional warfare. November decision, viewed in retrospect, represents worst possible strategic choice, committing enough to lose resources without committing enough to win. Better to have evacuated in September when losses were manageable. Better to have committed overwhelming force in October that might have achieved decisive victory. Instead, Japanese command chose middle path that maximized losses while minimizing chance of success. The psychology driving this decision reflects political dynamics where neither Army nor Navy wanted to be responsible for abandoning Guadalcanal. Compromise satisfied political requirements while creating strategic disaster. By December, that disaster becomes apparent to everyone except those still pretending Guadalcanal can be held. November 14th through 15th, 1942. Battle of Tassafaronga demonstrates both Japanese tactical excellence and strategic futility. That American destroyer squadron intercepts Japanese supply convoy at 23:32 hours, radar detecting 10 destroyers and cruisers approaching Guadalcanal from northwest. Admiral Carleton Wright commands American force, 4 cruisers and 6 destroyers positioned to execute coordinated gun and torpedo attack. Initial engagement favors Americans. Radar-directed fire striking Japanese destroyer Takanami and setting it ablaze. But then, Japanese long-lance torpedoes arrive, invisible until warheads detonate against American cruiser hulls. Northampton takes 3 torpedoes amidships and sinks in 4 hours. New Orleans has bow blown completely off, 60-foot section disappearing in single explosion. Minneapolis and Pensacola sustain damage requiring months of repair. The tactical victory belongs to Japan. But strategic outcome is failure. Only 2 of 7 transports succeed in landing supplies, and those supplies amount to perhaps 25 tons, rather than 200 tons the convoy was supposed to deliver. December the 7th, 1942, first anniversary of Pearl Harbor. Marines conducting patrol beyond Henderson Field perimeter discovered Japanese supply dumps containing captured enemy rations. Analysis reveals extreme malnutrition content, rice mixed with tree bark and weeds, protein sources reduced to occasional fish and whatever can be scavenged. Medical officers examining these rations calculate that soldiers consuming this diet cannot maintain combat effectiveness for more than weeks before starvation undermines physical capability. Intelligence officers realize that Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal is slowly starving despite express runs continuing to deliver troops. The arithmetic is brutal. Express runs maximize human cargo at expense of food and ammunition. Japanese command is reinforcing forces while allowing them to starve. Tactical absurdity driven by strategic desperation. Japanese Navy ship losses through December accumulate to unsustainable levels. 2 cruisers sunk, Kinugasa and Yubari. 11 destroyers sunk, Mutsuki, Udachi, Akatsuki, Amagiri, Nagatsuki, Takanami, Kikutsuki, Ayanami, Hayashio, Kawakaze, Teruzuki. 12 transports destroyed attempting supply runs. These losses represent approximately 15% of Japanese destroyer strength in Pacific theater. Ships that cannot be replaced within months, even if shipyards operated at maximum capacity. More critically, experienced destroyer crews are dying faster than training programs can produce replacements. Japanese Navy's institutional knowledge, that expertise in night fighting and torpedo tactics that made express runs possible, is being consumed in operations that deliver diminishing returns, while losses accelerate. American destroyer losses, while painful, are sustainable through industrial production that vastly exceeds Japanese capacity. 7 destroyers sunk through December represents approximately 3% of Pacific Fleet destroyer strength, percentage that's being replaced monthly by new construction. USS Porter, USS Meredith, USS Preston, USS Walker, USS Benham, USS Monson, USS Blue. Each loss mourned, but each replaced within weeks by vessels launching from American shipyards. Cruiser losses similarly sustainable. USS Juneau, USS Atlanta, USS Northampton. Tragic losses involving thousands of casualties but representing fraction of American cruiser strength. The exchange rate increasingly favors America, not because American forces are winning individual engagements, but because American industrial base can absorb losses that cripple Japanese naval strength. Supply delivery success rate reveals why express runs cannot sustain Japanese garrison even when they avoid catastrophic combat losses. November 11th through 12th operation, intended to deliver 200 tons of supplies, actually landed 60 tons before air attack forced withdrawal. Subsequent runs deliver even less. Its December runs averaged 30 to 50 tons delivered per mission, despite ships loading 100-plus tons before departing Shortland Islands. The deficit comes from combat losses, jettisoned cargo when ships take damage, and inability to complete unloading before dawn forces withdrawal. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal require minimum 100 tons daily to maintain combat operations. Actual deliveries through December average 20 tons daily, the shortfall compounds weekly, garrison strength increasing through troop deliveries while supply stockpiles decrease, creating impossible situation where more soldiers have less food and ammunition. Comparative logistics demonstrate American advantage grows exponentially through autumn. Henderson Field operates transport aircraft that deliver 200-plus tons weekly. Navy flights occurring during daylight under fighter protection that makes Japanese interdiction suicidal. Cargo ships approach Guadalcanal every few days when weather permits, unloading thousands of tons before withdrawing under air cover. Submarine supply runs, inefficient but useful for critical items, deliver medicine and ammunition when surface vessels cannot operate. American supply chain delivering approximately 1,500 tons weekly to forces requiring perhaps 600 tons weekly for sustained operations. Surplus accumulates, stockpiles grow. Marines transition from conservation mentality to abundance mentality, where ammunition and food are available without rationing. Fuel consumption data reveals another dimension of unsustainability. Japanese destroyers configured for express runs consume fuel oil at prodigious rates. Maximum speed operations burning through reserves that cannot be replenished from southern resource areas. American submarines have created gauntlet that Japanese tankers must transit to reach forward bases. Losses among tanker fleet reaching 30% annually. The petroleum that fuels express runs comes from reserves that are being depleted faster than replacement deliveries. By December, Japanese naval commanders at Rabaul face choice between reducing express runs to conserve fuel or maintaining operations while accepting that fuel constraints will eventually halt all operations. Neither choice is sustainable. Reducing runs means garrison starves faster. Maintaining runs means exhausting fuel reserves that cannot be replaced. The logistics trap is closing independently of combat outcomes. December 20th, 1942. A Japanese garrison commander, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, radios Tokyo with assessment that is carefully worded but unambiguous in meaning. Island cannot be recaptured with current resources. The message acknowledges reality that Tokyo has been avoiding for weeks. Guadalcanal is lost. 25,000 Japanese troops occupy positions around the island, but they cannot retake Henderson Field. Supply situation makes sustained operations impossible. Medical conditions are catastrophic, diseases killing more troops than combat. Morale has collapsed as soldiers realize they're being sacrificed without hope of victory. Hyakutake isn't requesting withdrawal. That decision exceeds his authority. But he's making clear that continuing operations means accepting complete loss of forces committed without achieving objectives. December 31st, 1942. Japanese Navy formally proposes to Imperial General Headquarters that Guadalcanal be evacuated and defensive perimeter consolidated farther north. The proposal includes detailed logistics analysis showing that sustaining garrison requires resources that don't exist. Express runs cannot deliver sufficient supplies. Air cover cannot be maintained given Henderson Field's operational capacity. Naval forces cannot guarantee supply line security. Further reinforcement means throwing additional troops into situation that guarantees their eventual loss without compensating strategic gains. The recommendation is professionally phrased to avoid explicitly admitting defeat, but meaning is clear. Guadalcanal is indefensible. Withdraw while forces can still be extracted. Consolidate defensive positions at Bougainville and Rabaul, where geography favors defenders. Except that 6 months of fighting achieved nothing except demonstrating that American industrial capacity makes attritional warfare unwinnable for Japan. The strategic assessment rippling through Japanese command recognizes implications extending far beyond one island. If Guadalcanal cannot be held despite months of reinforcement and thousands of casualties, then entire defensive perimeter concept is flawed. Americans have demonstrated they can concentrate forces against any position and sustain operations until Japanese logistics collapse. The vision of impregnable defensive barrier forcing negotiated peace evaporates when confronted with reality that America can simply keep feeding resources into operations until Japanese capacity breaks. Yeah, the psychological impact is devastating. Japanese military doctrine rested on assumption that American decadence would prevent sustained commitment to grinding warfare. Guadalcanal proves that assumption catastrophically wrong. Americans fought longer, accepted higher casualties, and maintained operations under conditions that should have forced withdrawal. The evidence suggests that attritional warfare favors America, meaning Japanese strategy requires fundamental revision that command structure is institutionally incapable of executing. Last Tokyo Express runs through December continue from momentum rather than strategic logic. Ships still sail south, delivering troops who cannot be adequately supplied. Sailors still risk death in operations that achieve nothing except delaying inevitable outcome. The futility is apparent to everyone, except those making decisions in Tokyo, where political considerations prevent acknowledgement of strategic failure. By year's end, express runs have delivered approximately 13,000 reinforcements to Guadalcanal, while losing irreplaceable naval assets that might have been employed defending positions that could actually be held. The cost-benefit analysis is catastrophic. Japan gained nothing except demonstrating its own inability to sustain forward-deployed forces against American logistics superiority. The lesson will be ignored through 1943 as Japan repeats Guadalcanal pattern across Pacific, reinforcing isolated garrisons that cannot be adequately supplied, losing troops and ships in futile defense of positions that eventually fall anyway. Guadalcanal should have taught Japan that its strategic approach was fundamentally flawed. Instead, It became first chapter in lengthy instruction manual on how to lose a war through institutional refusal to adapt. December 1st, 1942. Henderson Field Operations Officer files daily status report, showing 65 aircraft operational number that represents transformation in American air capability from desperate defense to offensive force projection. The aircraft composition includes F-4F Wildcats, F-4U Corsairs newly arrived, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, T-BF Avenger torpedo bombers, and P-38 Lightning fighters capable of escort missions deep into Japanese-held territory. This concentration of air power, staged from the very airfield Japan built, and then it gives Americans capability to interdict Japanese supply lines during daylight, while providing umbrella protection for American shipping approaching Guadalcanal. The strategic equation has inverted completely from August, when Marines prayed that Henderson Field could be made operational before Japanese recaptured it. December 4th brings first major American offensive sortie launched from Guadalcanal, rather than defensive response to Japanese attack. 24 aircraft attack Japanese positions at Gizo Anchorage, destroying supply dumps and damaging coastal vessels attempting to support Tokyo Express operations. The strike demonstrates Henderson Field's transformation from liability requiring protection to asset enabling offensive operations. Marine and Navy pilots who spent months defending the island now range across Solomons attacking Japanese installations, interdicting shipping, providing reconnaissance that gives American commanders comprehensive intelligence picture. Japanese forces that previously operated with relative freedom during daylight now move only at night, concealment becoming necessity rather than tactical choice. December 9th, 1942. General Alexander Vandegrift receives orders that signal fundamental change in campaign objectives. Expand defensive perimeter, prepare for offensive operations. Establish supply dumps forward of current lines. The instructions assume Guadalcanal is secure, that Japanese forces cannot threaten Henderson Field, that Marines should begin planning how to exploit their position rather than merely defending it. Vandegrift convenes staff meeting, where operational planning shifts from survival focus to exploitation focus, which Japanese positions should be targeted first. How to coordinate air, naval, and ground forces for amphibious operations beyond Guadalcanal. What reinforcements are required to sustain offensive operations while maintaining garrison strength? The questions reflect confidence that was unimaginable 4 months earlier when Marines wondered whether they'd be evacuated. December 20th brings radioed message from Japanese garrison commander that American intelligence intercepts and decodes. General Hyakutake informs Tokyo that island cannot be recaptured with current resources, assessment that American commanders greet with grim satisfaction. The message confirms what battlefield indicators suggested. Japanese forces are defeated not through decisive battle, but through logistical strangulation. They hold positions across eastern Guadalcanal, but cannot mount offensive operations. They receive intermittent reinforcement, but lack supplies to sustain combat. Medical situation is catastrophic. Diseases killing troops faster than express runs can replace them. Morale has collapsed to point where Japanese soldiers surrendering, behavior previously unthinkable in Japanese military culture. The garrison persists through inertia rather than strategic purpose, awaiting orders that high command is too paralyzed to issue. December 31st, 1942. Japanese Navy's formal proposal for Guadalcanal evacuation reaches Imperial General Headquarters with supporting analysis that cannot be refuted. American supply capacity exceeds Japanese capacity by order of magnitude. American reinforcement arrives regularly, while Japanese reinforcement hemorrhages ships and lives. American air superiority makes daylight operations suicidal for Japanese forces. The recommendation doesn't explicitly admit defeat. Japanese institutional culture makes such admission politically impossible, but implied meaning is unambiguous. Withdraw while extraction is still feasible. Cut losses before entire garrison is destroyed. Redirect resources toward positions that can be defended successfully. The proposal sits in bureaucratic channels through January, while troops on Guadalcanal starve and die. Political paralysis preventing decision that military logic demands. American troop reinforcements through December transform Guadalcanal from tenuous marine outpost to major forward base. 25,000 additional troops land, combination of Marine and Army units that raise American strength to 50,000 combat effectives plus support personnel. This force dramatically exceeds requirements for defending Henderson Field, surplus strength available for offensive operations. Supply stockpiles accumulate as Henderson Field's logistics infrastructure expands. Food sufficient for 30-plus days of operations without resupply. Ammunition stocks adequate for sustained combat operations. Fuel reserves that allow unrestricted vehicle and aircraft operations. Medical facilities capable of treating hundreds of casualties simultaneously. Construction materials for expanding facilities and fortifications. And everything that Marines lacked in August now exists in abundance, testament to American industrial capacity mobilized effectively. Aircraft availability at Henderson Field reaches 80-plus operational units daily by year's end, numbers that give Americans overwhelming air superiority within 200-mile radius. Japanese aircraft still raid from Rabaul, but losses are unsustainable. Replacement aircraft consumed faster than production can deliver them. Fighter sweeps from Henderson Field interdict Japanese reconnaissance, leaving enemy commanders ignorant of American dispositions. Bomber strikes suppress Japanese airfields at Bougainville and Shortland Islands, reducing sortie rates and effectiveness. The air campaign has shifted from desperation defense to methodical destruction of Japanese aviation infrastructure, grinding down enemy capability through attrition they cannot afford, while Americans easily replace losses. Japanese garrison strength reaches approximate peak of 25,000 troops in December, but this number misleads because combat effectiveness has collapsed. Troops suffering from malnutrition cannot conduct sustained operations. Soldiers lacking ammunition cannot defend positions effectively. Units without proper medical care suffer casualty rates from disease that approach combat casualty rates. Intelligence estimates suggest that actual Japanese combat effective strength is perhaps 8,000 troops, less than one-third of nominal garrison size. Everyone else is sick, starving, or so demoralized that combat effectiveness is negligible. The contrast with American forces, well supplied and adequately rested, creates overwhelming tactical advantage even without numerical superiority. Casualty ratio shift through autumn reveals how completely tactical balance has changed. American monthly casualties declining from August peaks despite increased tempo of operations. Japanese monthly casualties increasing despite reduced defensive activity. The reversal comes from supply differential. Well-fed troops resist disease better. Adequately supplied units maintain defensive positions that casualties cannot penetrate. Air superiority protects ground forces from bombardment while enabling strikes against enemy positions. Every advantage compounds. Americans get healthier while Japanese get weaker. Americans receive reinforcements while Japanese reinforcements arrive already depleted. The trajectory is inexorable. By January, Japanese forces on Guadalcanal represent defeated army awaiting permission to acknowledge defeat. Psychological transformation among Marines parallels material improvements. Troops who spent August wondering whether evacuation was imminent now discuss which Japanese-held islands will be targeted next. Companies that rationed ammunition in September now train with live-fire exercises that consume thousands of rounds. Battalions that dug defensive positions in October now conduct offensive patrol operations, probing Japanese lines. The confidence is earned through survival, through discovering that they could outlast enemy forces that started with every advantage except industrial capacity. The first American offensive of World War II has succeeded not through brilliant tactics or decisive battles, but through capacity to sustain operations longer than enemy. The lesson will define Pacific War strategy: isolate enemy positions, establish air and naval superiority, maintain supply lines while interdicting enemy logistics, accept attritional warfare that favors side with greater resources. Guadalcanal proves the formula works. Subsequent operations will replicate it across Pacific until Japan exhausts capacity to resist. January 4th, 1943. Imperial Conference convenes in Tokyo with agenda item that cannot be openly discussed but shapes every decision. Guadalcanal is lost. 6 months of fighting, 31,000 casualties, irreplaceable naval and air assets consumed, all to hold an island that cannot be held. Army leadership argues for evacuation, presenting logistics analysis that shows garrison will be completely destroyed within weeks if withdrawal doesn't commence immediately. Navy leadership reluctantly concurs, acknowledging that further express runs mean sacrificing ships and crews for no strategic purpose. The consensus is unprecedented. Japanese military doctrine emphasizes fighting to last man. Retreat dishonors emperor and contradicts warrior tradition. But continuing Guadalcanal operation means losing forces that might defend positions where success is actually possible. Imperial Conference approves Operation K, withdrawal of Guadalcanal garrison, while framing decision in language that avoids explicit admission of defeat. Operation K planning proceeds with attention to detail that characterizes Japanese military excellence when properly applied. Withdrawal must happen quickly before Americans realize what's occurring and interdict extraction. Express runs will reverse function, evacuating troops rather than delivering them. Destroyers optimized for speed will make multiple runs, loading maximum personnel while sacrificing everything else. Air cover will be provided by concentrated fighter sweeps intended to suppress Henderson Field operations during critical phases. Deception operations will suggest continued reinforcement rather than withdrawal, maintaining illusion that Japan is escalating rather than evacuating. The plan is audacious, technically complex, dependent on coordination and timing that must execute flawlessly under American observation. Though Admiral Tanaka, commanding evacuation fleet, reviews the plan and concludes it's possible, but requires operational security so tight that even garrison forces won't know evacuation is happening until ships arrive. January 14th, 1943. American intelligence detects increased Japanese naval traffic in Shortland Rabaul area. Analysis suggests another major express run, possibly regimental-size reinforcement attempting to break stalemate. Assessment is based on signal intercepts showing destroyer concentrations and supply ship movements consistent with troop delivery operation. What American intelligence doesn't detect is subtle difference in Japanese communications pattern. References to evacuation are carefully disguised as reinforcement discussions. Ship configurations favor personnel capacity over cargo capacity. Destroyer assignments include vessels previously held in reserve rather than those routinely assigned to express runs. The deception succeeds because Americans expect continuation of established pattern, reinforcement rather than withdrawal, making alternate interpretation of intelligence indicators seem unlikely. January 30th, 1943. 20 Japanese destroyers enter waters north of Guadalcanal just after sunset, moving in coordinated formation toward beaches where 8,000 Japanese troops wait in concealed positions. American radar detects the force immediately, but interpretation remains consistent with supply run expectation. Henderson Field launches strikes against what's assumed to be reinforcement convoy. Aircraft attack destroyers throughout the night, but coordinated evasive maneuvers minimize damage. More critically, destroyers don't deviate from course toward pickup points where troops are assembling. American pilots report stubborn persistence, suggesting supply mission of unusual importance. What they're actually witnessing is extraction operation executing with precision that reflects months of planning and tactical excellence that Japanese Navy maintains even as strategic situation collapses. Evacuation proceeds faster than plan projected. Troops board destroyers with discipline that surprises even Japanese commanders. No panic or confusion, despite awareness that this is abandonment of position held at tremendous cost. 8,000 soldiers embark in 4 hours. Destroyers never stopping engines. Personnel simply waiting out and climbing cargo nets while ships maintain steerage. These American air attacks continue through the night, but achieve minimal effect. Darkness and evasive maneuvers preventing accurate bomb delivery. By 0300 hours, lead destroyers are already withdrawing with full personnel complements. Second wave enters at 0400, repeating evacuation, while American forces remain convinced they're observing supply run rather than extraction. The operational security is extraordinary. Not until dawn, reconnaissance reveals beaches empty. Does American command realize that Japanese forces have withdrawn rather than reinforced? February 1st through 7th brings additional evacuation runs as Operation Key extracts remaining garrison forces. Third wave evacuates 3,000 troops from western beaches. Our final wave extracts last defenders plus naval personnel who'd been stranded when earlier express runs failed. Total evacuation. Approximately 11,000 soldiers and sailors withdrawn under American observation, with 0 ships lost to enemy action. Japanese casualties during evacuation, 600 killed from air attacks and shore bombardment, tragic but minimal compared to what might have been lost if garrison remained. The operational success is remarkable. Japanese Navy executed complex multi-night operation under air attack while maintaining deception that prevented American forces from concentrating interdiction efforts that might have been devastating. Admiral Tanaka's post-operation assessment becomes legendary in naval history. In 40 years of naval service, that I have never seen coordination this precise. The statement reflects genuine professional pride in operation, executed flawlessly under impossible conditions. Japanese destroyers made multiple high-speed runs into waters controlled by American air power, evacuated 11,000 troops without losing a single ship, maintained operational security sufficient that Americans miscalculated intentions until evacuation was nearly complete. The tactical excellence stands in stark contrast to strategic failure that necessitated evacuation. Japanese forces proved they could execute extraordinarily difficult operations. They couldn't overcome fundamental resource disadvantage that made Guadalcanal indefensible regardless of tactical skill. American miscalculation during Operation K reveals limits of intelligence advantage. Its signal intercepts provided warning that major Japanese naval activity was occurring. Reconnaissance detected destroyer concentrations and track patterns. But analysis framework expected reinforcement rather than evacuation, causing interpreters to fit evidence into pre-existing assumptions. Fighter squadrons were positioned in patrol zones optimized for interdicting supply runs rather than evacuation operations. Attack waves targeted ships assumed to be delivering cargo rather than extracting personnel. The failure demonstrates that intelligence advantage means nothing if command structure interprets information through lens of expectation rather than considering alternative explanations. Japanese deception succeeded not through brilliant misdirection, but through exploiting American tendency to assume enemy behavior would follow established patterns. February 9, 1943. American ground forces conducting patrol operations beyond Henderson Field perimeter discover Japanese positions are abandoned, bunkers empty, supply dumps depleted, defensive works intact, but defenders gone. Initially interpreted as tactical withdrawal to different positions, reconnaissance eventually determines that entire garrison has evacuated. The realization produces mixture of relief and frustration. Relief that costly ground offensive won't be necessary to clear remaining resistance. Frustration that enemy escaped without significant additional casualties. American commanders recognize immediately that they've been deceived. The Japanese executed withdrawal right under observation. That operational security and deception prevented interdiction that might have destroyed evacuating forces. The professional respect is grudging but genuine. Japanese lost Guadalcanal, but they saved forces that might have been annihilated. Strategic implications of successful evacuation complicate simple narrative of American victory. Yes, Guadalcanal is secured. Yes, Japanese abandoned position they'd fought desperately to hold. But 11,000 veteran troops escaped to fight again, forces that will defend subsequent positions in Solomons and New Guinea. Japanese Navy demonstrated capacity for complex operations under hostile conditions, capability that will make future operations more difficult. Most importantly, Aum's successful evacuation suggests that American air superiority isn't absolute, that Japanese forces can maneuver effectively when properly planned and executed. The psychological impact cuts both directions. Americans celebrate conquest of Guadalcanal while recognizing that enemy remains formidable. Japanese acknowledge defeat while maintaining institutional confidence that they can still compete tactically even when strategic situation deteriorates. Operation K represents Japanese military capability at its finest and most futile. The evacuation succeeded brilliantly, saving thousands of soldiers who would otherwise have died or been captured. But success in extraction doesn't compensate for failure in campaign. 6 months of fighting, 30,000 Japanese casualties, hundreds of aircraft destroyed, dozens of ships lost, yet all to hold island that was eventually abandoned anyway. Resources consumed in Guadalcanal operation might have defended Rabaul more effectively or established stronger positions in New Guinea. Instead, they were expended in futile attempt to retake airfield that Americans held from August through campaign's end. The strategic lesson is clear, but will be ignored. Japan cannot win attritional campaigns against American industrial capacity. Every isolated position that must be reinforced by sea and air becomes trap-consuming resources that cannot be replaced. Guadalcanal should have taught this lesson definitively. Instead, it becomes first chapter in repeated pattern, where Japan commits forces to indefensible positions, fights desperately to hold them, eventually evacuates or loses forces entirely. The pattern will repeat until Japan exhausts capacity to continue war. February 9, 1943. General Alexander Vandegrift issues orders declaring Guadalcanal secured after final Japanese evacuation is confirmed through reconnaissance patrols finding abandoned positions. The declaration marks official end to campaign that began with landings on August 7th, 6 months of fighting that transformed obscure tropical island into symbol of American determination and Japanese vulnerability. Total campaign duration exceeded by factor of 10 the 2 to 4 weeks originally projected. Nothing about Guadalcanal proceeded according to plan. Yet somehow, despite disasters and near evacuations and months of desperate fighting, American forces held the island and Japanese forces withdrew. The outcome wasn't inevitable in August. It became inevitable through capacity to sustain operations that enemy could not match. American casualty accounting reveals costs that exceeded expectations but remained sustainable. 1,600 Marines and soldiers killed in ground combat. 4,200 wounded, many returning to duty after treatment. 5,000 additional casualties from disease, malaria, and dysentery, proving as dangerous as Japanese bullets. Naval casualties from Ironbottom Sound battles. 5,000 sailors dead on ships sunk in night actions, where American forces learned hard lessons about combat they weren't prepared to fight. Air casualties. 800 pilots and air crew killed over Guadalcanal and surrounding waters. Total American casualties approach 15,000, Number that would have been considered catastrophic in peacetime, but becomes acceptable when measured against strategic gains achieved. Japanese forces driven from southern Solomons. Henderson Field secured as forward base. American military proven capable of sustained offensive operations. The cost was high but not prohibitive. Japanese casualty figures reveal magnitude of defeat that Tokyo struggled to acknowledge. 25,000 soldiers killed in combat or died from disease on Guadalcanal, approximately three-quarters of all forces deployed to the island. 9,000 additional troops died from disease before evacuating. Soldiers who embarked on ships but never survived voyage to rear areas. Naval casualties from express runs and surface battles. 8,000 sailors killed when ships were sunk or damaged. The air casualties. 3,000 pilots and aircrew lost over Guadalcanal and surrounding waters. Total Japanese casualties exceed 45,000, its number representing approximately 15% of all Japanese military casualties in Pacific War to that point. The losses are staggering, not just in absolute numbers, but in irreplaceability. Veteran infantry divisions destroyed, experienced naval crews killed, trained pilots lost. These cannot be replaced within time frame that strategic situation demands. Ship loss tally demonstrates naval attrition that redefined Pacific War balance. American Navy lost 5 cruisers and 2 destroyers sunk in Guadalcanal waters. Painful losses representing approximately 2% of Pacific fleet strength. Japanese Navy lost 2 battleships damaged beyond immediate repair. 2 cruisers sunk, and 11 destroyers sunk, and 12 transports destroyed. The percentage losses for Japan exceed 15% of destroyer strength and represent losses that cannot be replaced through existing construction programs. More critically, destroyer losses constrain Japanese ability to conduct express-style operations at other locations. Every position that must be reinforced by fast surface runs now competes for destroyer assets that are increasingly scarce. The naval arithmetic permanently shifted in American favor during Guadalcanal campaign, not through decisive battle, but through cumulative attrition that Japanese industrial base cannot reverse. Aircraft loss statistics foreshadow Pacific War's eventual outcome with brutal clarity. American forces lost 613 aircraft in combat over and around Guadalcanal. Losses that were replaced within 3 months through production deliveries that averaged 200 aircraft monthly to Pacific Theater. Japanese forces lost 1,500 aircraft, losses requiring 9 months to replace at production rates that peaked at 160 aircraft monthly. The differential in replacement capacity means that every air campaign favors America. Every engagement where aircraft are destroyed tilts long-term balance further toward Allied forces. More critically, American pilot losses were partially offset by rotation policy, bringing experienced pilots home to train new aviators. Japanese pilot losses were complete losses, veterans dying without passing knowledge to replacements. By February 1943, average experience level of American pilots in Pacific exceeds Japanese average. Reversal from wars beginning that will only accelerate. Pilot replacement strategy reveals doctrinal difference that determined air campaign outcomes. American military rotated experienced pilots home after combat tours, using them as instructors who trained replacement pilots in tactics proven effective in combat. The system created feedback loop where lessons learned translated rapidly into improved training that produced better prepared aviators. Japanese military kept pilots in combat until they were killed, maximizing short-term effectiveness while sacrificing long-term sustainability. Veteran Japanese pilots who survived months of combat possessed extraordinary skill, but when they died, their experience died with them. Replacement pilots arrived without benefit of veteran instruction, not learning through combat experience that many didn't survive long enough to acquire. The systemic difference meant American pilot quality improved throughout war, while Japanese quality declined. Strategic resource expenditure comparison shows why Guadalcanal outcome was predetermined by industrial capacity differential. Japan spent approximately 5% of annual industrial output on Guadalcanal campaign: ships, aircraft, ammunition, fuel, supplies, personnel. That expenditure strained logistics network and competed with other theaters for scarce resources. America spent equivalent of less than 1% annual industrial output on Guadalcanal. Losses were replaced without constraining operations elsewhere. Resources allocated to campaign didn't prevent simultaneous buildup in other theaters. The differential reveals why attritional warfare favored America. Japanese couldn't afford to lose resources at rates required to contest American offensives. Americans could afford to lose resources at rates that would bankrupt Japanese logistics. The mathematics were inexorable. Campaign that lasted 6 months, consuming 5% of Japanese annual output, was unsustainable. Campaign that lasted 6 months, consuming 1% of American output, could continue indefinitely. Production capacity impact demonstrates how Guadalcanal accelerated American advantage while degrading Japanese capability. Aircraft losses forced Japan to increase production at expense of quality, factories cutting corners to meet quantity demands. American aircraft production increased 60% during campaign while maintaining quality standards. Additional capacity coming from new factories rather than existing facilities operating beyond optimal parameters. Japanese aircraft produced in 1943 will show measurably lower reliability than 1942 production. American aircraft produced in 1943 will show improved performance over previous years. The industrial divergence means that every subsequent air campaign starts with American advantages that didn't exist in August 1942. How Americans won campaign where they never achieved clear tactical advantage becomes question that defines subsequent Pacific War strategy. Ground battles favored defenders, meaning Marines survived attacks but didn't achieve breakthrough victories. Naval engagements were mixed outcomes, with American forces losing heavily in night battles, while Japanese suffered in daylight. Air combat was attritional, both sides losing aircraft at rates that seemed unsustainable. Yet somehow, American forces held island while Japanese were forced to evacuate. The answer is logistics. Americans maintained supply lines that delivered food, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements throughout campaign. Japanese supply lines deteriorated progressively until garrison was starving despite Tokyo's efforts to sustain them. Victory came not through tactical brilliance but through industrial capacity translating into sustainable operations that enemy couldn't match. Strategic trajectory for Pacific War becomes visible through Guadalcanal campaign. Japan cannot defend every position. Attempting to do so means spreading forces too thin, creating vulnerable points that Americans can exploit. But abandoning positions means accepting that defensive perimeter is contracting, that war is being lost progressively. Japanese command faces impossible choice between defending everywhere inadequately or abandoning positions and accepting strategic defeat. Americans face no equivalent dilemma. Industrial capacity allows them to concentrate overwhelming force against any objective. Losses are replaced faster than they're incurred. Supply lines are sustainable indefinitely. The strategic initiative has shifted permanently to Allied forces. Will Japan adapt strategy or continue repeating Guadalcanal pattern becomes question that history answered with depressing predictability. Subsequent Pacific campaigns will see Japan defending isolated positions, losing troops and ships in futile attempts to sustain garrisons, eventually evacuating or seeing forces destroyed. New Guinea, Bougainville, Marianas, Philippines. Each campaign will follow Guadalcanal template. Japanese forces fight courageously but cannot overcome logistical disadvantages that make defeat inevitable. American forces advance methodically, accepting casualties but maintaining operations until Japanese capacity collapses. The pattern repeats until August 1945, when industrial exhaustion and atomic weapons finally convince Tokyo that continuation is impossible. Guadalcanal's true victory wasn't seizing the island or destroying Japanese garrison. True victory was proving that American industrial resources could sustain grinding attritional warfare that Japan could never match. And 6 months of fighting demonstrated that American determination wasn't propaganda, that industrial capacity could be translated into military effectiveness, that strategic patience combined with material superiority would eventually prevail regardless of Japanese tactical excellence or courage. The lesson shaped Pacific War's remainder. Americans learned they could win through persistence and resources. Japanese learned they couldn't. But institutional paralysis prevented strategic adaptation that might have created defensive positions actually sustainable. Guadalcanal was first chapter in book, whose conclusion was written in industrial production figures published before war even started. America could outproduce Japan by factors measuring in multiples. Given enough time, that advantage would prove decisive. Guadalcanal was simply the proof of concept.